Section 1. The Show That Never Sleeps. Facts 1 through 30. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up, close your eyes if you want, and just let the words wash over you. Because for the next few hours, we're going to take a slow, easy walk through one of the most fascinating television shows ever made. There's no rush here. No deadline. Just facts, stories, and quiet corners of the Simpsons universe that most people have never thought to look into. The Simpsons first aired on December 17th, 1989. Not as a full series at first, but as a short animated segment on The Tracy Ullman Show, where it had been quietly living since 1987. By the time it became its own standalone program, the show had already been brewing for 2 full years inside the body of someone else's variety program, watched by millions of people who mostly thought of it as a quirky little interlude between sketches. Nobody predicted what it would become. Fact 1. The Simpsons holds the record as the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running American sitcom, and the longest-running American scripted primetime television series, all at the same time. No other show in the history of American television holds all 3 of those titles simultaneously. It didn't just break records. It made records that may never be broken again, simply because the entertainment landscape has changed so much that a show running for 36 years and counting is something that may never happen in quite the same way. Fact 2. The show was created by Matt Groening, a cartoonist and writer from Portland, Oregon, who came up with the Simpson family name while sitting outside a studio executive's office at the Fox network. He had been invited to pitch a different project entirely, an adaptation of his comic strip Life in Hell. But as he sat in the hallway, he had a sudden instinct that handing over his most personal creative work to a network might not be the wisest decision. So he invented an entirely new family on the spot. The Simpsons were born in a hallway, in about 15 minutes, from a man who didn't want to give away something he cared about more. Fact 3. The name Homer was taken from Groening's own father. Marge was named after his mother. Lisa and Maggie were named after his sisters. Bart was an anagram that Groening invented himself, though he's mentioned that it felt like it suited a troublemaking young boy in a way that no real name quite did. The only member of the family without a direct real-world namesake is Bart, which somehow feels appropriate. He was always going to be the one who didn't quite fit the mold. Fact 4. When the show was first picked up as a full series, the Fox network was so new and so unproven that many in the television industry didn't expect it to survive long enough for the show to matter. Fox had launched only in 1986 and had already struggled to establish itself against the 3 major networks. The Simpsons was, in a very real sense, a bet. A bet that a cartoon about a working-class family could find a primetime audience that had never been offered anything like it before. Fact 5. The first episode of the full series, called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, aired on December 17th, 1989, and was actually a Christmas special rather than a traditional series premiere. The episode follows Homer discovering that his Christmas bonus has been canceled, secretly taking a job as a mall Santa Claus, and eventually adopting a greyhound named Santa's Little Helper from a dog racing track after the dog loses its final race. It's a gentle, slightly melancholy episode that ends on warmth rather than a punchline, and it established a tone that the show would return to again and again across its run. Fact 6. Santa's Little Helper, the Simpson family dog introduced in that first episode, was based on a real greyhound that the show's producers had seen at a racing track during the development period. Greyhound racing was still a relatively common spectacle in the late 1980s, and the image of a dog being discarded after losing a race had a particular emotional weight that the writers wanted to use. The dog's status as a castaway who finds a home became a quiet metaphor that matched Homer's own feeling of being undervalued and overlooked. Fact 7. The show's theme music was composed by Danny Elfman, who wrote and recorded it in a single day. Elfman has described the process as unusually fast even by the compressed standards of television production. He was given a general description of what the show was and what the tone should feel like, and he went home and came back with the now iconic theme. The piece he wrote includes a moment of deliberate strangeness, a brief passage that sounds almost like a theremin, which Elfman has said was intended to give the otherwise bright and comedic music a slight edge of the surreal. Fact 8. The couch gag. The brief animated sequence at the end of the opening credits in which the family runs to the couch in increasingly absurd ways was originally designed simply as a way to adjust the running length of each episode. If an episode ran slightly short, the couch gag could be extended. If it ran slightly long, the gag could be cut down. What began as a purely logistical tool became one of the most celebrated recurring elements in television history, eventually attracting guest animators, filmmakers, and artists from around the world who were invited to create their own version. Fact 9. The chalkboard gag, in which Bart writes a different humorous sentence repeatedly on a school blackboard at the start of every episode, was also a production tool at first. A quick visual way to establish Bart's character and the show's irreverent tone before the main story began. Some of the early chalkboard gags were genuinely controversial, touching on school discipline and authority in ways that drew complaints from parent organizations. The show kept doing them anyway. Fact 10. The original voice cast recorded their first lines together in a room, seated at a table, which was an unusual arrangement for animation at the time. Most animated productions recorded voices individually to give directors more control over each performance. The Simpsons chose a more theatrical approach, letting the cast play off each other, interrupt each other, and find rhythms together that couldn't have been planned in advance. That collaborative energy in the recording booth shaped the show's comedic DNA from the very beginning. Fact 11. Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer Simpson, based Homer's famous expression of frustration on something he'd heard in real life. The sound that became "dough" was inspired by Jimmy Finlayson, a Scottish actor who appeared in many Laurel and Hardy films in the 1920s and 30s, and who had a habit of producing a long, drawn-out expression of exasperation that sounded something like "do." Castellaneta shortened it, sharpened it, and made it Homer's own. The word was so widely adopted that it was officially added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2003. Fact 12. Julie Kavner, who voices Marge Simpson, has spoken about the physical toll that Marge's distinctive, raspy voice places on her throat. The voice requires a specific kind of tension and gravel that Kavner maintains through careful vocal technique, and she has acknowledged that extended recording sessions can be genuinely tiring in ways that ordinary speaking is not. Despite this, she has voiced Marge consistently for over 35 years without a single replacement. Fact 13. Nancy Cartwright, who voices Bart Simpson, is one of the most recognizable voices in American entertainment, and yet most people who know the voice have never connected it to the actress behind it. Cartwright has discussed the peculiar anonymity of voiceover work, particularly for a character as beloved and iconic as Bart. She can walk down a street completely unrecognized, and then do the voice for a single sentence and watch every head in the room turn. The voice is famous. The person is invisible. Fact 14. Yeardley Smith, who voices Lisa Simpson, originally auditioned for the role of Bart. The producers heard her voice and decided it was too soft and gentle to work for a character defined by mischief and aggression. They offered her Lisa instead. Smith has said in interviews that she was hesitant at first because Lisa felt quieter and less flashy than Bart, but that she came to see Lisa's interior life as the more interesting creative challenge. She was right. Lisa Simpson became one of the most complex characters in television animation. Fact 15. Hank Azaria, one of the most versatile voice actors in the show's history, voiced dozens of characters throughout his tenure, including Apu Nahasapi Mapetilon, Mo Zislak, Chief Wiggum, Professor Frink, and many others. He has said that one of the most technically demanding aspects of the role was switching between these characters rapidly during table reads, sometimes playing two characters on opposite sides of a conversation within the same scene. The speed and precision required to keep each voice distinct was something he described as more athletic than artistic. Fact 16. Harry Shearer, who voices Mr. Burns, Smithers, Principal Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, Dr. Hibbert, and a considerable number of other characters, came from a background in satire and radio that gave him an unusually wide range. Shearer had been a cast member of Saturday Night Live and had co-written and starred in This Is Spinal Tap before joining The Simpsons. His comic instincts were already sophisticated and genre-aware by the time he brought Mr. Burns to life, and much of Burns's theatrical, 19th-century quality came directly from Shearer's choices, rather than from what was written on the page. Fact 17. The color yellow was chosen for the Simpson family's skin tone by a design decision that has since become one of the most recognized visual signatures in global entertainment. The decision was deliberate. When a viewer is flipping through channels and glances at a television screen, the yellow immediately tells them they're looking at The Simpsons. No other show uses that color for human characters. It was a branding choice disguised as an aesthetic one, and it worked better than anyone could have predicted. Fact 18. The four-fingered hands that all Springfield characters share is a tradition that goes back to the earliest days of hand-drawn animation. Drawing a full hand with 5 fingers was technically difficult and time-consuming for animators working at scale, so the convention of 4 fingers became standard across cartoon production. The Simpsons retained this convention even as technology made it less necessary. It became part of the show's visual identity, a deliberate nod to the animation tradition from which it came. Fact 19. The show's first season was produced with a relatively small budget and a production team that was figuring out processes as they went. The animation was handled by a Korean studio called Klasky Supo, and the early episodes have a slightly rougher, more angular look compared to the smoother animation of later seasons. Some fans prefer the first and second season animation for exactly this quality, finding a rawness in it that feels appropriate to the show's early working-class tone. Fact 20. Matt Groening has a recurring cameo tradition throughout the show. His name appears on a gravestone in several episodes, and in a small number of moments, a cartoon version of him appears within Springfield's universe. He's also given himself the tradition of hiding the letters M and G somewhere in nearly every episode, though finding them requires the kind of frame-by-frame examination that wasn't practical before home video and streaming made pausing so easy. Fact 21. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, took nearly 15 years of discussion before it was finally made. The concept of a feature film had been raised during the show's early seasons, but the producers consistently felt that the show was generating enough strong material on television that a movie would need to offer something the small screen couldn't. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that they felt they had a story genuinely worth telling at that scale. The film grossed over $500 million worldwide. Fact 22. Al Jean, one of the show's longest-serving executive producers, joined the writing staff in the very first season and has been involved in nearly every aspect of the show's creative direction since then. Jean graduated from Harvard at the age of 20, was one of the youngest writers on the original staff, and has outlasted virtually everyone else who was in the room at the beginning. His tenure represents one of the longest continuous creative relationships between a single writer and a single television show in American history. Fact 23. The show has been translated into more than 50 languages for broadcast around the world. Each translation presents unique creative challenges, because so much of the show's humor is built around wordplay, cultural references, and expressions that don't exist in other languages. Some dubs have replaced American cultural jokes with local equivalents to make the comedy land properly in different countries. The German dub is particularly well regarded among fans for the quality of its cultural adaptation. Fact 24. Springfield has a specific geography that the show has both carefully constructed and deliberately contradicted. It has a nuclear power plant, a harbor, a mountain range, an ocean beach, a desert, a gorge, a forest, and a downtown district, all within reasonable driving distance of each other. No real American city has this combination of geographic features, and the show knows it. The impossibility of Springfield's geography is a feature, not a mistake. Fact 25. The show's writing room has historically been staffed with an unusually high concentration of graduates from elite universities, particularly Harvard. At various points, the writing staff included so many Harvard alumni that it was sometimes described as an informal Harvard comedy club. This academic background shows in the show's willingness to make jokes that require some level of literary, historical, or scientific knowledge to fully appreciate, even when those jokes are surrounded by pure slapstick. Fact 26. The Simpsons has a tradition of episodes set outside Springfield that has allowed the show to parody everything from Australian culture to Japanese television to Brazilian tourism. Each international episode required specific research and often generated specific controversy. The Brazil episode, in particular, drew protests from the Brazilian government, which objected to the show's portrayal of Rio de Janeiro as unsafe and infested with monkeys. The show apologized in the most Simpsons way possible, by airing a fake apology that wasn't entirely sincere. Fact 27. The show has had well over 1,000 guest voices across its run, including heads of state, Nobel laureates, rock musicians, classical composers, athletes, actors, directors, and at least one person who appeared as themselves only to be killed in the same episode. The guest star policy of the show has always been that the celebrity must serve the story, not the other way around, a principle that was enforced more strictly in the early seasons and has relaxed somewhat as the show continued. Fact 28. Bart Simpson's full name is Bartholomew Jojo Simpson. This was revealed relatively early in the show's run, and promptly ignored for decades at a time, surfacing occasionally when the plot required a formal or official reference to Bart's legal identity. The middle name Jojo was chosen for its inherent comedy, the way it sits so awkwardly between the biblical gravity of Bartholomew and the casual American plainness of Simpson. Fact 29. Homer's middle name is J. This is confirmed in multiple episodes. The J doesn't stand for anything, a gag the show has deployed to puncture the expectation that a middle initial must carry some formal meaning. Homer J. Simpson is not Homer James Simpson or Homer Joseph Simpson. He is simply Homer J. Simpson, and the J is whatever you need it to be. Fact 30. The Simpsons has aired episodes on every major American holiday. It has done Christmas, Halloween, Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day, and the 4th of July in ways that have become so culturally embedded that for many viewers, the holiday isn't quite complete without a Simpsons episode attached to it. The Treehouse of Horror Halloween specials, which began in the second season, became so beloved that they're now one of the most anticipated events in the television calendar each year, regularly drawing larger audiences than most of what's on the air around them. Number, Section 2. Homer Simpson, America's most dangerous employee. Facts 31 through 60. There's something deeply comforting about Homer Simpson. Even knowing everything that he's done and everything that he's failed to do, he's not a bad person. He's a person who tries in his own way and comes up short in his own spectacular fashion, and somehow that makes him more human than almost any other character television has produced. Let's spend some time with him. Fact 31. Homer's job title at the Springfield nuclear power plant is Safety Inspector for Sector 7G. The irony built into this title is so vast and so perfectly constructed that the show has never needed to explain it. The man responsible for ensuring that a nuclear facility doesn't poison an entire town is someone the show's own creator has described as having an IQ of 55. He has fallen asleep at his workstation more times than any other documented fictional employee in the history of American television. Fact 32. Homer's employment at the plant has a backstory that the show reveals in fragments across many seasons. He was originally hired as part of a deal struck between Mr. Burns and Homer's father, Abe Simpson. After Abe witnessed Burns commit an unspecified crime, Burns offered Homer guaranteed lifetime employment at the plant in exchange for Abe's silence. This means that Homer's career security, which has always seemed like a cartoon convenience, is actually the result of a corrupt agreement made before Homer was old enough to understand what was happening to him. Fact 33. Homer has held over 250 different jobs across the show's run, according to fan counts that have tracked every episode. He has been a boxer, a food critic, a monorail conductor, a country music manager, a snowplow operator, an astronaut, a bodyguard, a missionary, a paparazzo, a film producer, a police officer, a truck driver, a deep-sea oil rigger, and a member of a barbershop quartet, among many, many others. Each new job typically lasts exactly one episode before the show resets to the nuclear plant. Fact 34. The episode in which Homer goes to space, Deep Space Homer, is one of the most technically researched episodes in the show's history. The writers consulted with NASA to ensure that the details of the launch sequence, the spacecraft interior, and the physics of zero gravity were as accurate as possible while still being comedically functional. The episode includes a real bag of potato chips floating in microgravity, which Homer desperately tries to eat, and the scene captures something genuine about the disorientation of weightlessness. Fact 35. Homer's relationship with food is one of the most consistent and carefully developed character traits in the show. His love of donuts, in particular, has been established so thoroughly that the donut has become as much a symbol of Homer as his voice or his physique. The show has explored this through dream sequences, through Homer's subconscious, through fantasy and nightmare, and through at least one episode in which Homer is given the opportunity to eat a donut the size of a small automobile. Fact 36. Homer's brain, as depicted in the show's various fantasy and cutaway sequences, operates as something close to a separate character. The show has visualized Homer's thought process multiple times, usually as a small Homer in a control room making spectacularly poor decisions in real time. One of the most famous of these sequences shows Homer's brain explaining to Homer that it has replaced all of his memories with the theme from the television show Meow Mix, which is to say that the jingle for cat food has displaced his ability to form coherent new memories. Fact 37. The episode Homer's Enemy, in which a competent, hardworking man named Frank Grimes is hired at the nuclear plant and cannot comprehend how Homer has survived and even thrived in an environment that should have destroyed him, is often cited by writers and critics as the show's most darkly realistic episode. Frank Grimes sees Homer clearly, without the warmth and affection that filters everyone else's view of him, and what he sees is a man who has been rewarded for failure at every turn. The episode ends with Grimes's death and Homer sleeping through the funeral. It is one of the most unsettling half hours the show has ever produced. Fact 38. Homer's physical resilience throughout the show has been a subject of genuine fan analysis. He has been shot, electrocuted, set on fire, hit by vehicles, fallen from significant heights, had heavy objects dropped on him, been attacked by animals, and survived a staggering number of situations that would be fatal to a normal human being. The show treats this as comedy, but the cumulative effect is that Homer's body has absorbed enough trauma to qualify him as functionally indestructible by the standards of any realistic medical assessment. Fact 39. Homer's relationship with beer, specifically Duff beer, is as central to his character as his relationship with donuts. The show created Duff as a fictional brand that immediately took on a life of its own. Merchandise, novelty items, and eventually actual licensed beer products bearing the Duff name have appeared in multiple countries. The show occasionally gestures at the fact that Homer's drinking might constitute a real problem, but always pulls back before committing to that reading, keeping Duff in the comfortable space of character quirk rather than dramatic flaw. Fact 40. Homer's strangling of Bart, the reflex response to Bart's misbehavior that has appeared in hundreds of episodes, is one of the most immediately recognizable visual gags in television history. The show has used it so consistently for so long that it has become almost a ritual, a way of marking the end of a Bart-generated disaster. Notably, in later seasons, the show began to occasionally subvert the gag by having Bart dodge the strangling, or by having Homer unable to reach Bart in time, a small acknowledgement that even the most reliable of the show's running jokes eventually needed variation. Fact 41. Homer's relationship with his father Abe, also known as Grandpa Simpson, is marked by a particular kind of mutual disappointment that the show treats with surprising tenderness. Homer is embarrassed by his father. Abe is often invisible to his son. But the show has repeatedly paused to let the weight of this dynamic settle, particularly in episodes that explore Abe's memories and the life he lived before Homer was born. Abe Simpson was, by his own account, a man who did remarkable things and is now reduced to being ignored in a retirement home. The show doesn't let that land without feeling. Fact 42. Homer's intelligence, or the dramatic lack of it, has been explained in the show through at least two separate mechanisms. The first is the crayon that was lodged in his brain during childhood, apparently the result of an accident that nobody noticed or treated. The second is the accumulated effect of radiation exposure from working at the nuclear plant for decades. In the episode where the crayon is removed, Homer's IQ rises to the point where he becomes fully articulate, analytically sharp, and genuinely capable of understanding the world around him. He immediately finds this unbearable and has the crayon replaced. Fact 43. The episode where Homer's IQ rises after the crayon removal is one of the few in the show's history that directly explores what Homer might have been under different circumstances. Intelligent Homer is not simply the same character with better vocabulary. He's quieter, more observant, sadder in a way that the regular Homer isn't, because he can see clearly what his life is and what it has cost him. The show uses this as a brief, devastating portrait of potential that was lost before it could develop, and then it puts the crayon back and everyone laughs. Fact 44. Homer was a member of the B-Sharps, a barbershop quartet that achieved brief but significant fame in an episode that parodies the Beatles' rise and dissolution. The episode, titled Homer's Barbershop Quartet, presents Homer's musical career as a recovered memory, a period he had apparently forgotten entirely. The quartet story mirrors the Beatles so closely that the show includes a character modeled directly on Yoko Ono, a figure whose arrival coincides with the group's creative dissolution, and the episode ends with a rooftop concert that recreates the Beatles' famous final live performance on top of the Apple Records building. Fact 45. Homer's love of television is depicted as something close to a spiritual practice. He watches it the way other characters in other shows go to church, with a reverence and a surrender that suggests he finds in it something his waking life doesn't offer. The show has used Homer's television watching as a mirror for its own audience, occasionally catching Homer watching something that the audience is presumably also watching, creating a loop of self-reference that the show has always deployed with just a touch of knowing mischief. Fact 46. Homer's car, a beat-up pink sedan that has been identified at various points as a 1986 Plymouth Junkerola, or simply as Homer's car, is as much a character in the show as the house or the plant. It has broken down in the middle of important journeys, been destroyed and replaced, been modified in ways that defied engineering logic, and once became the center of an episode about Homer's relationship with his own financial decisions. The car is a rolling monument to Homer's approach to life, optimistic, frequently failing, and somehow still getting where it needs to go. Fact 47. Homer's attempts to be a good father are one of the show's most reliable sources of both comedy and genuine emotion. He is, by any objective measure, a deeply imperfect parent. He forgets important dates, misreads his children's emotional needs, makes decisions based on what he wants rather than what they need, and occasionally puts his own comfort ahead of their welfare in ways that would be alarming in a realistic domestic drama. And yet the show continually returns to the fact that Homer loves his children with an intensity that compensates for almost everything else. When he gets it right, he gets it profoundly right. Fact 48. The scene in which Homer teaches Bart to shave, depicted in a flashback in one of the show's more tender episodes, is often cited by writers on the show as an example of the kind of small domestic moment that made the early seasons work so well. It's not a joke in the conventional sense. It's a father and a son doing something simple together, and the simplicity is what gives it weight. Homer is fully present in that moment, in a way that he often isn't, and the show lets the audience feel it. Fact 49. Homer's voice has changed measurably over the show's run, becoming slightly deeper and more settled in the later seasons compared to the higher, slightly more frantic quality it had in the early years. Dan Castellaneta has attributed this partly to the natural aging of his own voice and partly to the character himself becoming more familiar and comfortable in his own skin. The early Homer is anxious in a way the later Homer isn't, and the voice reflects that. Fact 50. Homer's dream life, as depicted in several fantasy sequences and the Treehouse of Horror episodes, reveals a subconscious that is simultaneously more sophisticated and more chaotic than his waking behavior suggests. In his dreams, Homer encounters gods, monsters, talking objects, and versions of himself that function as psychological archetypes. The show uses these sequences to explore aspects of Homer's inner life that the realistic format of a regular episode doesn't allow, and what emerges is a picture of a man whose interior world is considerably stranger and more vivid than the one he presents to the world. Fact 51. Homer's fear of failure is one of the most consistently explored emotional threads in the show. He begins many episodes with a grand ambition and ends them having learned something, though the lesson rarely sticks across episodes. The show's writers have said that this was a deliberate structural choice. Homer must remain capable of growth within a single episode while remaining unchanged between episodes, because the moment he actually learns from his mistakes and becomes wiser, he's no longer Homer Simpson. He's someone else. Fact 52. Homer's love for Marge is the emotional bedrock of the show in a way that sometimes gets overlooked because it's so constantly present. The show has put the marriage in crisis many times, having Homer and Marge separate, misunderstand each other, and nearly drift apart in ways that feel genuinely threatening. But the show always returns them to each other because their love is presented not as a romantic fantasy, but as something earned, chosen, and renewed constantly in the daily texture of a shared life. Fact 53. The episode where Homer discovers that Marge had a brief romantic interest in her high school prom date before settling on Homer is one of the show's best examples of how it handles jealousy and insecurity. Homer's reaction is not violent or dramatic. It's quietly devastated in the way that real jealousy is, and the episode's resolution involves not a grand gesture, but a simple conversation in which both Homer and Marge are honest about what they want from each other. For a cartoon about a man who eats donuts and strangled his son, It's a remarkably mature piece of writing. Fact 54. Homer has appeared on the cover of Time magazine within the show's universe, a meta-joke that the show has deployed in several episodes. The image of Homer on the cover of Time was eventually matched by real life, when the actual Time magazine ran a cover story on The Simpsons and used Homer's face as the primary image. The line between the show's fictional self-awareness and the real cultural landscape it occupied became productively blurry in moments like this. Fact 55. Homer's relationship with money is a constant source of dramatic tension and comedy. He earns a salary that the show has placed at various figures across its run, but the household is consistently depicted as financially precarious, always one unexpected expense away from genuine difficulty. This economic anxiety, which was very deliberately built into the show's premise, is part of what made The Simpsons resonate so powerfully with working-class audiences who saw their own financial stress reflected back at them. Fact 56. Homer has a secret room in his house that he discovered accidentally and turned into a personal sanctuary. The room first appeared in the episode where Homer finds a forgotten space behind a bookcase, and the show used it as a meditation on the universal desire for a space that belongs entirely to oneself, away from obligations and noise. Homer's hideaway contained a recliner, snacks, and a small television, which is to say it contained everything Homer considers essential to human happiness. Fact 57. Homer's bowling team, the Pin Pals, was a significant part of his social life in several early episodes, and the bowling alley where they played was one of the show's recurring settings during its first few seasons. The bowling alley has appeared less frequently in later years, but its early prominence established that Homer's social world existed in working-class leisure spaces, rather than in the country clubs and restaurants that defined the leisure activities of wealthier Springfield residents. Fact 58. Homer has a tendency to be genuinely moved by beauty in ways that surprise the people around him. He cried at a sunrise in one episode. He was visibly affected by a piece of music in another. He stared at a painting for 20 minutes in an art museum while Bart and Lisa expected him to be bored. The show uses these moments sparingly enough that they land with real impact, each one suggesting that underneath the buffoonery there is a person with a genuine capacity for wonder that the world he lives in doesn't know quite how to accommodate. Fact 59. Homer's most famous emotional moment in the entire run of the show is arguably the end of the episode Mother Simpson, in which he sits on the hood of his car and watches the stars after saying goodbye to his mother. The scene lasts about 40 seconds. There is no dialogue. There is only Homer, alone, looking up, and the credits rolling over him. The show's producers have said that they debated whether to include any music under the scene and ultimately decided that silence was more powerful. They were right. Fact 60. Homer's character was partly inspired by Groening's own father, and partly by a working-class American archetype that Groening felt was not being represented honestly on television. The working-class fathers who existed on television before Homer tended to be either competent and reassuring or comically incompetent in a harmless way. Homer was something different. He was genuinely flawed in ways that had real consequences, genuinely loving in ways that weren't always expressed well, and genuinely part of a world where doing your best and having your best not be good enough was a lived experience rather than a punchline. Number, Section 3. The Simpson Family Secrets. Facts 61 through 90. The Simpson family is, on the surface, a fairly standard nuclear unit. Mom, dad, 3 kids, a dog, a cat. But the deeper you go into their history, the more you find buried underneath the routine of Evergreen Terrace. There are secrets in this family that span generations, and the show has spent 36 years revealing them in fragments. Fact 61. Marge Simpson's full maiden name is Marge Bouvier. Her family, the Bouviers, are depicted as slightly more genteel than the Simpsons, though not by any significant degree of actual sophistication. Marge's mother is particular about appearances and manners in a way that suggests she grew up with aspirations that never quite materialized into the life she imagined. Marge inherited this gap between expectation and reality and has spent her married life navigating it with a patience that occasionally tips over into genuine frustration. Fact 62. Marge's hair? The iconic blue tower that she maintains in exactly the same shape regardless of the weather, the decade, or the physical logic of human hair, is estimated within the show to stand approximately 2.5 feet tall. It contains, among other things, her emergency fund in the early seasons, and has been used as a hiding place for various items across the show's run. The color is described as blue-gray, and Marge has confirmed in at least one episode that it is not naturally that color, though the show has never been entirely consistent on this point. Fact 63. Marge was briefly employed at the Springfield nuclear power plant during a period when the family needed additional income. This means that both Homer and Marge have been exposed to the facility's notoriously hazardous working conditions, a detail that the show drops and rarely revisits, but that sits quietly in the background of the show's environmental critique. Both parents were inside that plant. All three children were born to parents who worked inside that plant. Fact 64. Marge's sisters, Patty and Selma Bouvier, are among the most consistent supporting characters in the show. They share a deep mutual loathing of Homer that is so thoroughly established it functions as a natural law of the Springfield universe. Patty and Selma smoke constantly, work at the DMV, and take a particular pleasure in Homer's misfortunes that the show occasionally tips from comedy into something slightly more uncomfortable. Their relationship with Marge is warm in a way that their relationship with Homer could never be. Fact 65. Selma Bouvier has been married multiple times across the show's run, including to Lionel Hutz the lawyer, Sideshow Bob the criminal, a man she met through a prison pen pal program, and at one point, in a Las Vegas episode, to Homer himself, which created a brief but legally significant complication for Homer's existing marriage to Marge. Selma's romantic history is one of the show's most consistently developed running storylines. A low-key character arc played mostly for comedy, but with occasional moments of genuine poignancy about loneliness and the desire for connection. Fact 66. Bart Simpson's full academic record, as pieced together from various episodes, suggests that he has been in the 4th grade for every year of the show's run. He has been evaluated, tested, tutored, threatened with being held back, and occasionally shown glimpses of genuine intelligence that he immediately suppresses. Because being smart in a school run by Skinner and surrounded by his particular peer group offers far fewer social rewards than being the class troublemaker. Bart's underachievement is partly laziness and partly a strategic social choice. Fact 67. Bart's relationship with his teacher, Mrs. Krabappel, is one of the show's most unexpectedly rich dynamics. Edna Krabappel is a deeply tired woman who has been teaching 4th grade for so long that she has largely stopped expecting anything from it. She and Bart see each other clearly, without illusion, and from that clarity comes something that isn't quite respect but isn't quite contempt either. The show has given them occasional moments of real warmth, usually late in episodes when the comedy has run out and something truer has to fill the space. Fact 68. Mrs. Krabappel was voiced by Marcia Wallace, who died in October of 2013. After her death, the show retired the character rather than recast her. In the episode that followed, a brief on-screen tribute appeared during the chalkboard gag, with Bart writing, "We'll really miss you, Mrs. K." It was one of the most quietly moving moments in the show's history, a break in the fiction to acknowledge something real that had happened in the world outside. Fact 69. Lisa Simpson was initially conceived as the moral conscience of the show, the character whose values and intelligence would serve as a check on Homer's impulsiveness and Bart's chaos. What the writers discovered quickly was that a character who is always right and always morally superior becomes insufferable unless she's also given genuine vulnerabilities and blind spots. Lisa's arrogance, her occasional self-righteousness, her deep need for validation, and her difficulty forming friendships all emerged as writers found ways to make her moral clarity cost her something. Fact 70. Lisa plays alto saxophone. This was decided early in the show's development, partly because the saxophone was an instrument that fit the show's jazz-influenced musical aesthetic, and partly because it gave Lisa a form of expression that didn't require words, which is significant for a character who uses words so constantly and sometimes so ineffectively. Lisa's saxophone playing is depicted as genuinely skilled, not as a joke. The show has always treated her musicianship with respect. Fact 71. Lisa's conversion to Buddhism in the show's 12th season was treated by the writers as a permanent character change rather than a one-episode arc. She remains a practicing Buddhist in all subsequent episodes, making it one of the few genuine long-term character developments in the show's history. The episode that introduced her conversion, She of Little Faith, was written with input from actual Buddhist scholars and practitioners, and the show was careful to present the conversion as a sincere spiritual journey rather than a joke at religion's expense. Fact 72. Lisa's vegetarianism is another permanent character change that the show has maintained consistently since the episode in which she adopts it. The episode, Lisa the Vegetarian, includes a scene in which Paul McCartney agreed to appear only on the condition that the show commit to Lisa remaining vegetarian in all future episodes. The producers agreed, and the show has honored that commitment. It's one of the few instances in the show's history where a guest star's personal values directly shaped a character's permanent trajectory. Fact 73. Maggie Simpson's silence is one of the show's most deliberate creative choices. The producers decided very early that having a talking baby would undermine the comedy in a particular way, because a talking baby has to be made clever or cute in ways that draw attention to itself, whereas a silent baby can be used as a perfect reactive presence, a witness to the chaos around her without becoming part of it. Maggie's silence also allowed the show to use her speech as a rare and therefore meaningful event. Fact 74. Maggie's first word in the show was Daddy, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a cameo that the show treated as an event significant enough to build an entire episode around. Taylor was deeply moved by the assignment, by some accounts, and approached the single word with the kind of preparation and care she brought to much larger roles. The moment, when it comes in the episode, is genuinely affecting, both because of what it means within the story and because of the weight that Taylor's voice carries with it. Fact 75. Maggie shot Mr. Burns. This is the official verdict. But the episode itself has been analyzed so carefully by so many fans over so many years that the official verdict feels more like a legal determination than an artistic certainty. The show planted enough contradictions and alternative readings in the two-part story that reasonable people can disagree about what actually happened, which may have been the point all along. Fact 76. The extended Simpson family includes a number of relatives who have appeared across the show's run with varying degrees of regularity. Homer's half-brother Herb Powell, voiced by Danny DeVito in 2 memorable episodes, is one of the most fully realized of these relatives. A man who built a fortune from nothing, gave it all away in a moment of brotherly generosity, rebuilt it through invention, and never quite lost his complicated feelings about the family whose existence he didn't know about until adulthood. Fact 77. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, is officially a veteran of the Second World War, though the specific campaigns he describes and the awards he claims have been inconsistent enough that the show effectively acknowledges that Abe's memory is not entirely reliable. He has claimed credit for things that were clearly done by others, described battles he couldn't possibly have been present for, and mixed genuine history with personal mythology in the way that very old people sometimes do, making it impossible to know where the truth ends and the story begins. Fact 78. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, was voiced by Glenn Close in the episode that introduced her and in several subsequent appearances before her death. Close brought a particular kind of restrained gravity to the role, a quality that made Mona feel genuinely haunted by the choice she made when she left Homer as a child. The scenes between Close and Castellaneta as Mona and Homer have a tenderness that's unusual for the show, and that several critics cited as some of the finest dramatic voice acting the show ever produced. Fact 79. The Simpson house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has a floor plan that has changed repeatedly across the show's run, sometimes dramatically, as different episodes have required different spatial arrangements. The kitchen has moved, the living room has grown, the basement has appeared and disappeared. The writers and directors have acknowledged this inconsistency and have generally treated the house as a space that can expand or contract to fit the needs of the story, rather than as a fixed architectural reality. Fact 80. The family television in the Simpson living room, positioned across from the couch that has hosted thousands of couch gags, has been upgraded, replaced, and altered across the show's run in ways that roughly track the real evolution of consumer television technology. The earliest episodes show a boxy cathode ray tube set. Later seasons introduced flat-screen televisions and eventually the kind of large, wall-mounted displays that became standard in American homes in the 2000s and teens. Fact 81. The Simpson family cat, Snowball, has died and been replaced multiple times across the show's run, with each new cat also named Snowball. The current cat is officially Snowball 5, though the show has periodically made the replacement a joke rather than a tragedy, with new cats arriving and being given the old name in a sequence that acknowledges the show's own habit of resetting to normal after significant changes. There have been episodes in which multiple snowball replacements occur within the same story. Fact 82. Homer and Marge's wedding, depicted in several flashback episodes over the years, has been retold with different details to match the floating timeline's shifting present. The original flashback placed their marriage in the early 1980s, consistent with the show's original setup. Later flashbacks have adjusted the setting, the cultural references, and the fashion to suggest a more recent decade. The story of how Homer and Marge got together is told differently depending on when you ask. Fact 83. Bart's best friend, Milhouse Van Houten, is widely considered one of the greatest secondary characters in animated television. Milhouse functions as Bart's loyal and perpetually unfortunate companion, someone who goes along with Bart's schemes not out of genuine enthusiasm, but out of a desperate need for the social approval that friendship with Bart provides. Milhouse's misery is, in the show's own universe, one of the fundamental constants of Springfield, as reliable as gravity. Fact 84. Lisa's best friend, Janie Powell, is notable primarily for how rarely she is developed. While Bart's friendship with Milhouse has been explored in considerable depth, Lisa's friendship with Janie exists mainly to give Lisa someone to stand next to. This relative neglect is itself a comment on something the show has always been aware of, that Lisa's intelligence and intensity make her genuinely difficult to befriend, and that her social isolation is partly a result of who she is, rather than simply external circumstance. Fact 85. The family's relationship with the Flanders family next door is one of the show's most consistently mined dynamics. Homer's resentment of Ned's competence and decency is a primal, irrational emotion that the show has never entirely resolved, because resolving it would require Homer to either become more like Ned or acknowledge openly why Ned bothers him so much. Neither has happened. The resentment persists, and the show occasionally uses it to say something true about the way people react to being made uncomfortable by someone else's goodness. Fact 86. Bart's rivalry with Martin Prince, the school's resident genius and overachiever, is less about academic competition and more about social positioning. Martin represents exactly the kind of visible, celebrated intelligence that Bart has chosen to reject, and Bart's treatment of Martin across the show's run ranges from casual cruelty to occasional moments of unexpected solidarity. The show has suggested more than once that Bart and Martin understand each other better than either would like to admit. Fact 87. Lisa's relationship with Bart has been one of the show's most carefully managed sibling dynamics. They argue, they undermine each other, they compete for their parents' attention in different ways and for different reasons. But the show has also given them episodes of genuine alliance and mutual support, usually in situations where external pressure has forced them to put aside their differences and act as a team. These episodes tend to be among the most emotionally satisfying in the show's history. Fact 88. The Simpson family eats dinner together at the kitchen table with a regularity that the show's writers have acknowledged is partly an artifact of the show's sitcom structure, rather than a realistic depiction of family life. But the dinner table has served as the setting for some of the show's most important conversations, the place where information is shared, arguments are started, and the family's internal dynamics are made visible in real time. The table is where the Simpsons are most clearly themselves. Fact 89. Homer and Marge have 3 children, but the show has periodically hinted at what a 4th child might have meant for the family. There's an episode in which Marge considers having another baby, and the emotional weight of that episode comes from the genuine ambivalence on both sides, Homer's fear of more responsibility and Marge's complicated feelings about her own desires and what she's given up. The episode doesn't resolve cleanly, which is part of what makes it one of the more honest family portraits the show has offered. Fact 90. The Simpsons, as a family unit, have survived things that would destroy most fictional families. They've faced bankruptcy, near divorce, death, illness, legal trouble, public humiliation, and existential crisis. They've come apart and come back together more times than any reasonable family should. And the show's answer to why they keep returning to each other is not a complicated one. It's the simplest thing. They are family. And in the world of The Simpsons, that word means something that neither disaster nor stupidity can fully dissolve. Number. Section 4. Mr. Burns and the Architecture of Power. Facts 91 through 120. If Homer is the heart of the show, Charles Montgomery Plantagenet Schicklgruber Burns is its shadow. He sits at the top of Springfield's economic food chain and has sat there for longer than any reasonable reading of human biology should allow. Let's look at him properly. Fact 91. Mr. Burns's full name, Charles Montgomery Burns, was chosen to carry a specific weight of old money aristocratic portentousness. The name sounds like something from a 19th century novel, which is appropriate because Burns himself seems to have emerged from one. He speaks in the syntax of a previous century, references events from history as personal memories, and maintains a relationship with modernity that is simultaneously contemptuous and pragmatic. He uses technology because it serves him, not because he values it. Fact 92. Burns's age has been established in various episodes as somewhere between 100 and 130 years old, depending on which episode you're using as your reference point and how literally you're reading the show's deliberately inconsistent continuity. What the show is consistent about is that Burns is very, very old by any human standard, and that his continued existence requires active, expensive, and medically extraordinary intervention on a regular basis. Fact 93. Burns's medical situation was most directly addressed in the episode The Springfield Files, in which it's revealed that his weekly medical treatment is so intense that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly one more week. Without it, he dies. The show presents this as an explanation for why Homer mistook him for an alien, but the actual implication is staggering. Burns is not surviving through any natural biological process. He is a machine that requires weekly servicing. Fact 94. The Three Stooges syndrome scene, in which Burns's doctor reveals that Burns has every disease known to medical science simultaneously, is one of the show's most quoted moments. The doctor's explanation is that all the diseases are present at once, competing to kill Burns, and because they're all equally present, they create a biological gridlock in which none can advance. Burns is described as the sickest man in the United States, but also functionally indestructible, at least until the equilibrium shifts. It is both a great joke and a genuinely terrifying concept. Fact 95. Burns served in the United States military during the Second World War, a fact established in several flashback episodes. His service was, by his own account, not distinguished by any particular acts of valor or loyalty to his fellow soldiers. Burns's wartime record includes at least one incident involving a stolen government asset, specifically a $1 trillion bill that was intended as a goodwill gesture to Europe and that Burns pocketed and hid for decades before it became the center of an international incident in a later episode. Fact 96. Burns attended Yale University, an institution he speaks of with the possessive warmth of someone who believes the school belongs to him personally, because he has donated enough money to it that it practically does. His Yale connection is depicted as a source of genuine identity for Burns, one of the few things from his distant past that he still relates to with uncomplicated affection. He was, by his own account, a different person at Yale, before the decades of power and isolation had done their work on him. Fact 97. Burns's relationship with Smithers is one of the most analyzed dynamics in the show. Waylon Smithers is unreservedly devoted to Burns in a way that the show has gradually made clearer over its run as something deeper than professional loyalty. Smithers loves Burns in the most straightforward sense of the word, and the show has handled this with increasing openness as American television's treatment of gay characters shifted over the decades. By the later seasons, the show was relatively direct about what Smithers felt for Burns, and about the fact that Burns, for all his perceptiveness in other areas, chose not to see it. Fact 98. Smithers manages Burns's schedule, his correspondence, his medical appointments, his transportation, his wardrobe, his diet, and his relationship with the rest of the world. He is effectively the entire administrative infrastructure of Burns's personal life, packed into a single human being. The show has occasionally asked what would happen if Smithers were removed from this role, and the answer is always the same. Burns would be helpless within days. Smithers isn't just devoted to Burns. He is operationally necessary to Burns's survival. Fact 99. Burns has attempted to block out the sun, harness the power of the ocean, and construct a personal army from genetically engineered creatures at various points in the show's run. Each scheme is presented as the logical extension of a man who has more money than any legitimate use for it, and who has spent so many years unchallenged that the concept of limits has become theoretical for him. Burns doesn't do things because they're possible. He does them because the idea that they might not be possible genuinely doesn't occur to him. Fact 100. The episode where Burns blocks out the sun, titled Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1, establishes that Burns's plan to steal the town's sunlight in order to force every resident to buy electricity from his plant is not primarily about the money, since Burns is already enormously wealthy. It's about control. Burns wants to demonstrate that every aspect of Springfield's existence, including the sun itself, can be made dependent on him. The plan is megalomania at the most literal possible scale. Fact 101. Burns's voice, as performed by Harry Shearer, has a particular quality of theatrical decrepitude that has been refined over 3.5 decades into something genuinely unique. Shearer has said that he thinks of Burns as a man performing the character of himself, a person who has been powerful for so long that he has forgotten where his actual personality ends and his public persona begins. The theatrical quality of Burns's speech isn't affectation. It's all that's left after everything more genuine has been worn away. Fact 102. Burns's manor, known to Springfield residents as Burns's Mansion, sits on a hill overlooking the town, in a position of deliberate geographic dominance. The building has appeared in enough episodes that its layout has been analyzed in considerable detail by fans, though the interior is as inconsistent as the Simpson house, expanding and contracting to fit whatever the story requires. The mansion has a room for every conceivable indulgence, and a history that Burns occasionally references in ways that suggest the building predates his occupancy and came to him through processes he prefers not to discuss. Fact 103. Burns's relationship with Homer has been the subject of multiple episodes that explore whether Burns is genuinely indifferent to Homer or whether he maintains a deliberate policy of not knowing his name as a way of keeping Homer in his place. In at least one episode, Burns appears to come close to genuine affection for Homer before something intervenes and the status quo reasserts itself. Whether this represents real warmth or simply Burns performing warmth when it's convenient is left deliberately unresolved. Fact 104. Burns has been shot, poisoned, pushed off buildings, attacked by animals, abandoned in the wilderness, and left for dead on multiple occasions across the show's run. He has survived all of it. The show never commits to a single explanation for this. Is it his medical regime? Is it his wealth, which ensures that resources are always available to rebuild him? Is it something stranger, some quality the radiation has given him over a century of exposure? The show leaves all of these possibilities open. Fact 105. Burns's biological weapons facility, destroyed by Mona Simpson and her activist group in 1969, is one of the show's darkest canonical details. Burns didn't just own a nuclear power plant that was poisoning Springfield through negligence. He also owned a facility designed to produce weaponized pathogens in the same community. The show presents this in the context of a specific episode about Mona's past, but the implication casts every other aspect of Burns's relationship with Springfield in a different light. Fact 106. Burns's family history, as described in various flashbacks and references, places him as the inheritor of a dynasty that predates many American institutions. The Burns family wealth is described as originating before the Industrial Revolution, which puts the family in a category of inherited power that is genuinely rarefied even by American standards of generational wealth. Burns didn't build an empire. He was handed one that was already old, and he has been maintaining and extending it for over a century. Fact 107. Burns has a stuffed animal that he's had since childhood, a bear named Bobo that becomes the center of an entire episode in which Homer finds the bear and Burns desperately tries to recover it. The episode, titled Rosebud, is a deliberate reference to Citizen Kane, and it uses the same structure of a powerful, isolated man whose happiness is tied to a simple object from his childhood to make a quiet point about what wealth and power actually cost. Burns gets Bobo back at the end. He doesn't look noticeably happier for it. Fact 108. Burns's political influence in Springfield is so comprehensive that the show periodically depicts him simply owning whichever political outcome he needs. Mayor Quimby is a reliable Burns ally, not through any ideological alignment but through pure financial dependency. Burns has funded Quimby's campaigns, covered his scandals, and ensured his continued incumbency in exchange for regulatory tolerance of the power plant's violations. The relationship between Burns and Springfield's political establishment is not corruption in the conventional sense. It's something more total than that. Fact 109. Burns's interest in Marge, depicted in the episode Marge Gets a Job, is treated as comedy but carries an undercurrent that some fans have used to support the theory that Burns's identification of Maggie, rather than Marge as his shooter, was an act of protection. Burns pursued Marge romantically in that episode with the kind of focused, entitled intensity that characterizes his approach to everything he wants. Whether he retained any of those feelings years later is not something the show ever confirms. Fact 110. Burns's most famous catchphrase, "Excellent," delivered with his fingertips pressed together, became so immediately recognizable that it entered common use as a shorthand for sinister satisfaction. The gesture itself, the steepled fingers, is one that Shearer has said he developed as a way of giving Burns a physical signature that communicated his sense of himself, a man who is always, in his own estimation, in control of whatever is happening. Fact 111. Burns's relationship with money is qualitatively different from Homer's in a way that the show has occasionally highlighted. Homer's desire for money is always about what it can buy, about food and comfort and security. Burns's relationship with money is more abstract. He accumulates it not because he needs what it can purchase, but because the accumulation itself is the activity. Burns is a hoarder in the oldest, most aristocratic sense of the word. Fact 112. Burns once tried to take over the entire world using a robotic Richard Nixon. This happened in a Treehouse of Horror episode and therefore exists in the show's non-canonical Halloween universe rather than its regular continuity. But the fact that the show considered Burns a plausible character for this ambition says something about how thoroughly it has established him as a man to whom world domination would feel like a reasonable next step. Fact 113. Burns has a habit of referencing historical events with the casual familiarity of someone who was present. He drops names from the early 20th century as personal acquaintances. He describes the Depression as an era he remembers experiencing, not reading about. He talks about major historical moments with the same slight boredom that people use when describing something they've seen too many times. The accumulation of these references is part of how the show builds the impression that Burns has simply been alive for an impossible length of time. Fact 114. Burns's most vulnerable moment in the entire run of the show may be the scene in which, during a rare honest conversation, he admits to Homer that his weekly treatments are the only thing keeping him alive. The scene is brief and played mostly for comedy, but the admission underneath the joke is genuinely bleak. Burns has organized his entire life around ensuring that the machinery that keeps him alive keeps running. He is not living. He is maintaining a system whose purpose is to continue existing. Fact 115. Burns's hatred of Mona Simpson, which persisted for decades after she destroyed his biological weapons lab, is presented in the show as something beyond ordinary grudge. Burns devoted real resources to tracking her down and preventing her return to Springfield. For a man as powerful and as busy as Burns, this sustained personal vendetta suggests that Mona's raid hit something in Burns that very little else could reach. Whether it was the destruction of the lab itself, or the simple fact that someone ordinary had successfully defied him, is never entirely clear. Fact 116. Burns's name was almost different. Matt Groening has mentioned that several other names were considered during development, all designed to carry the same weight of Victorian aristocratic evil. Burns was chosen partly for its phonetic quality, the hard consonants and the short, declarative sound of it, and partly because getting burned carried exactly the right meaning for a character whose primary mode of interacting with the world is exploitation. Fact 117. Burns owns a professional baseball team, the Springfield Isotopes, in at least one episode, and his management of it reflects his general management philosophy. He approaches it as a system to be controlled rather than a game to be appreciated, and his contempt for the players as individuals rather than assets is expressed with the particular clarity of a man who has never had to pretend to care about the feelings of anyone beneath him. Fact 118. Burns has met and been photographed with multiple United States presidents over the decades, and the photographs are displayed in his office as casual evidence of a life lived at the highest levels of access and influence. The photographs span enough decades to make clear that Burns's political connections are not a recent development, but a multi-generational relationship between his family's money and the American political system. Fact 119. Burns's capacity for genuine emotion has been demonstrated in a small number of episodes, usually in contexts that involve the very distant past. He can be momentarily moved by a piece of music that connects him to an earlier period of his life. He shows something that might be genuine feeling when he holds Bobo the stuffed bear. These moments are rare enough that they feel significant, and the show uses them to suggest that somewhere underneath everything that Burns has become, there is a person who once existed before power and isolation finished their work on him. Fact 120. The show has never explicitly resolved the question of what happens to Springfield when Burns eventually dies. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns. Burns has devoted a century to ensuring that the system sustaining him never fails. But the show's floating timeline guarantees that Burns's death will never come, not in any episode that airs, not in any conclusion that the writers are asked to provide. Burns will remain at the top of his cracked, glowing tower, watching Springfield with his steepled fingers and his excellent satisfaction for as long as the show runs, which may, at this point, be forever. Section 5. Springfield's Strangest Citizens. Facts 121 through 150. Springfield is full of people who couldn't exist anywhere else. The town has assembled a cast of supporting characters so rich and so thoroughly developed over 36 years that many of them have fuller lives than the main characters of shows that ran for fewer seasons. Let's spend some time with the residents. Fact 121. Ned Flanders was initially conceived as a straightforward foil for Homer, a neighbor who was simply better in every measurable way to highlight Homer's deficiencies. What the show discovered was that a character who is always good and always patient and always decent would become either saintly and uninteresting or quietly tragic and fascinating. Ned became the second option. The more the show explored the cost of his goodness, the more interesting he became. Fact 122. Ned's wife Maud Flanders was killed in a Treehouse of Horror episode that then established her death as part of the show's regular canon. Maud was hit by a t-shirt fired from a cannon at a NASCAR race, a death that the show's producers have acknowledged was influenced partly by a contract dispute with the actress who voiced her. The decision to kill the character was made quickly and has been revisited in fan analysis many times, as Maud's death fundamentally altered both Ned's character arc and the show's relationship with mortality. Fact 123. Chief Clancy Wiggum is Springfield's chief of police and one of the most thoroughly corrupt, incompetent, and yet oddly sympathetic law enforcement officials in fictional history. Wiggum is not malicious. He's simply very, very bad at his job, in ways that are both comically amplified and, in quieter moments, kind of understandable. He loves his son Ralph with a sincerity that cuts through the comedy, and his occasional moments of actual competence, when they come, are surprising enough to feel like genuine character revelations. Fact 124. Ralph Wiggum, Wiggum's son, is one of the show's most beloved supporting characters and one of its most economically deployed. Ralph's defining characteristic is a profound and cheerful disconnection from ordinary reality. He says things that don't connect to what anyone else in the scene is doing, operates according to his own internal logic, and occasionally produces observations of such complete non sequitur that they become inadvertently profound. The writers have said that writing for Ralph requires a specific discipline, finding the non sequitur that is funny without being merely random. Fact 125. Sideshow Bob, whose full name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., has appeared in more episodes than almost any other supporting character and has become so thoroughly developed that he qualifies as a secondary protagonist rather than a simple recurring villain. He is brilliant, theatrical, genuinely dangerous, and completely unable to resist the pull of his own ego, which is what has enabled Bart to defeat him every time. Sideshow Bob is destroyed not by Bart's cleverness but by his own grandiosity, his insistence on monologuing when he should be acting. Fact 126. Sideshow Bob is voiced by Kelsey Grammer, who has returned for the character consistently across the show's entire run. Grammer's theatrical baritone and his particular gift for conveying both genuine menace and wounded pride have made Sideshow Bob one of the most celebrated vocal performances in animation. The show has given him full Gilbert and Sullivan operettas to perform within episodes, and Grammer has sung them with the same commitment he brings to the dramatic scenes. Fact 127. Krusty the Clown, whose real name is Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yaruchim Krustofsky, is one of the show's most deliberately melancholy characters. He's a comedian who doesn't find anything funny, a performer who despises his audience, a man who has become his public persona so completely that he's lost track of what was underneath it. Krusty's backstory, which involves a complicated relationship with his rabbi father, who disowned him for choosing comedy over religious study, gives him a depth that his clown makeup rarely allows to surface. Fact 128. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon, the Quickie Mart owner voiced by Hank Azaria, was one of the show's most prominent supporting characters for many seasons. In 2017, a documentary called The Problem with Apu sparked a significant national conversation about the character's cultural sensitivity, leading Azaria to step away from the role. Apu has since been voiced by other actors and appears less frequently than in earlier seasons. The conversation the documentary started about representation in animation continues to resonate across the industry. Fact 129. Moe Sislak runs Moe's Tavern, which is Homer's primary social space outside of work and home. Moe is one of the show's most consistently pitiable characters, a man defined by failure in love, failure in business, and a deep, unresolved anger about both. The show has occasionally revealed that Moe's capacity for genuine feeling is larger than his circumstances have allowed him to express, and these moments, usually played quietly at the end of an episode that has been mostly comedy, are some of the show's most affecting. Fact 130. The Quick E-Mart, which Apu operates with tireless if bitter efficiency, is open 24 hours a day, which has been a source of ongoing distress for Apu across multiple episodes. The store sells products of questionable freshness and authenticity at prices that suggest a profound contempt for the intelligence of its customers. Apu is aware of all of this. His relationship with the store is one of someone who built something, resents what it has become, and can't figure out how to leave it. Fact 131. Professor John Frink, Springfield's resident scientist, speaks in a dialect of technical jargon mixed with verbal tics that the show has deployed as both a parody of scientific communication and a vehicle for actual scientific references. Frink's inventions are usually plausible extensions of real technology pushed to absurd extremes, and the show has occasionally used him to introduce genuine scientific concepts in the context of comedy. He is voiced by Hank Azaria in a voice modeled partly on Jerry Lewis's character from The Nutty Professor. Fact 132. Groundskeeper Willie, the Scottish groundskeeper at Springfield Elementary, is one of the show's most physically imposing characters, and one of its most unexpectedly poignant. Willie is a man far from home, working a job that nobody respects, maintaining school grounds with a pride that the institution itself doesn't share. His explosive anger, usually directed at Bart or at the general state of his existence, is the only form of genuine passion the job has left him with. Fact 133. Principal Seymour Skinner, who is actually Armin Tamzarian as established in one of the show's most controversial episodes, has a relationship with his mother Agnes that the show has mined for comedy and occasional darkness across decades. Agnes Skinner is one of the most unreconstructed maternal tormentors in American television. A woman whose love for her son is so intertwined with control and disappointment that the two are genuinely indistinguishable. Skinner's psychological damage, and the show is quite clear that it is extensive, flows directly from this source. Fact 134. Barney Gumble, Homer's best friend and Springfield's most devoted alcoholic, was a straight-A student before a single beer that Homer offered him on prom night sent him down a path from which he has not recovered. The show establishes this in a flashback that treats the moment with more gravity than might be expected from a show that usually plays Barney's drinking for easy laughs. Barney's trajectory is the saddest in Homer's immediate social circle, a portrait of potential entirely lost to a single choice. Fact 135. Comic book guy, whose actual name was eventually revealed in a late-season episode to be Jeff Albertson, is one of the show's most explicit pieces of self-parody. He represents a certain kind of media fandom, hyper-knowledgeable, professionally aggrieved, contemptuous of casual enjoyment, and deeply invested in maintaining hierarchies of cultural taste that serve primarily to make him feel superior to people who simply enjoy things. His catchphrase, "worst episode ever," has become so embedded in cultural vocabulary that it's used by people who have never watched The Simpsons. Fact 136. Disco Stu, who appeared first as a throwaway background character, became a fan favorite through the sheer commitment of his Disco Stu has been living in 1977 since 1977, and nothing in the intervening decades has disturbed this. He is not a parody of someone who missed the cultural moment. He is someone for whom no other cultural moment has registered as meaningful. Disco Stu dances on, oblivious and contented, which in Springfield is perhaps the most enviable mental state available. Fact 137. Hans Mollman, the tiny, near-blind, deeply unfortunate elderly man who serves primarily as the universe's punching bag in the background of Springfield scenes, has died in canonical episodes dozens of times and returned each time without explanation. He claimed in one episode to be 31 years old, a revelation that the show drops and never pursues, though it implies that whatever the environment around Springfield's nuclear plant has done to other residents, it has done something particularly extreme to Hans Mollman. Fact 138. Snake Jailbird, Springfield's most frequently arrested career criminal, has a relationship with the justice system that the show depicts as a kind of ecosystem rather than a corrective one. Snake commits crimes. Snake is arrested. Snake serves a minimal sentence. Snake commits more crimes. The cycle is so established that both Snake and the police seem to regard it as simply the natural order of things, an understanding between parties rather than a breakdown of social order. Fact 139. Dr. Nick Riviera, whose full name and credentials remain perpetually unclear, offers medical services of dubious safety at prices designed to appeal to people who cannot afford the town's legitimate medical care. His signature greeting, "Hi, everybody," responded to by the patient with "Hi, doctor," Nick, became one of the show's most repeated running gags, a ritual that functions as a kind of communal acknowledgement that the healthcare about to be received should probably not be trusted. Fact 140. Lionel Hutz, Springfield's most catastrophically incompetent attorney, was voiced by Phil Hartman, who died in May of 1998. Following Hartman's death, the character was retired. The show created a similar character named Gil Gunderson to fill the comedic space of the chronically failing professional, but Gil was never as beloved as Hutz, in part because the fondness audiences felt for Hutz was inseparable from their fondness for Hartman's performance. Fact 141. Troy McClure, the washed-up actor and perpetual spokesman for Springfield's various civic and commercial enterprises, was also voiced by Phil Hartman and was also retired after his death. Troy McClure's defining characteristic was his habit of introducing himself by listing two films that nobody had seen and that sounded increasingly improbable. The character became so beloved that after Hartman's death, many fans counted Troy McClure's absence as among the losses of genuine grief, separate from but connected to their grief for Hartman himself. Fact 142. Mayor Joe Quimby is a broad and unapologetic parody of the Kennedy political dynasty, specifically of Ted Kennedy, with elements drawn from various other patrician New England politicians. His accent, his hair, his relationship with fidelity and with public integrity all reflect a specific American political type that was more immediately recognizable in the early 90s than it might be today. Quimby has been Springfield's mayor for the show's entire run, which, given his record, suggests either that the elections aren't entirely free or that the voters have very specific priorities. Fact 143. Kent Brockman, Springfield's primary television news anchor, represents a specific kind of local news journalism in which the anchor's personality, vanity, and comfort have long since displaced any commitment to actual information. Brockman famously welcomed the approaching ant overlords during a live broadcast when he misunderstood a piece of footage from a space mission, which stands as one of the show's most efficient satires of the way television journalism responds to ambiguous information. Fact 144. Sideshow Mel, who replaced Sideshow Bob as Krusty's on-air assistant after Bob's imprisonment, is distinguished by a bone through his hair, a formality of speech that sits awkwardly beside his clown makeup, and a personality that the show has never quite decided how to use. He is, in some ways, the show's most untapped supporting character, someone who clearly has a full interior life that the show has simply never had time to explore. Fact 145. Otto Mann, the Springfield elementary school bus driver, is one of the show's most warmly regarded secondary characters, despite having one of the most alarming professional records of anyone in Springfield. Otto drives the school bus with the distracted enthusiasm of someone whose primary concerns are music and his own philosophical wanderings, and the show has never committed to showing the consequences of this arrangement in any sustained way, because doing so would require confronting something genuinely dark about the town's approach to child safety. Fact 146. Patty Bouvier came out as gay in the show's 16th season in an episode titled "There's Something About Marrying." The revelation was handled with more sensitivity than many expected from a show not primarily known for nuanced treatment of sexuality, and Patty's identity has been part of her character consistently since then. Her coming out was complicated by an episode-specific storyline involving a professional golfer she planned to marry, but the character herself was given the dignity of a story that took her seriously. Fact 147. Bumblebee Man? The Spanish-language television character who appears occasionally on the Springfield television broadcast and who is always depicted experiencing escalating physical misfortune while wearing a bumblebee costume is one of the show's most deliberately minimal characters. He exists almost entirely to be seen on television screens within the show, a show within a show that needs no explanation because slapstick is the most universal comedy there is. Fact 148. Fat Tony, Springfield's organized crime boss, represents the town's relationship with the mob in the same way that Mayor Quimby represents its relationship with politics, as something deeply normalized and not particularly alarming to the people who live with it. Fat Tony and his associates are treated by Springfield's residents with the casual acceptance of an institution that has simply always been there, like the power plant or the tire fire. Fact 149. The tire fire, a burning pile of tires at the edge of town that has been burning throughout the show's entire run, is one of Springfield's most enduring background details. It was established as a joke in an early episode and has simply remained burning in the background of Springfield establishing shots ever since, a small continuing catastrophe that nobody is addressing, nobody is particularly concerned about, and nobody has any apparent plan to resolve. Fact 150. Springfield's religious landscape, which includes Reverend Lovejoy's church and has periodically featured representations of many other faiths, has been one of the show's most consistently exploited subjects. Lovejoy is a minister who has become so exhausted by his congregation's spiritual neediness that his sermons have gradually emptied of any content beyond the most basic platitudes. He gives the minimum required and then goes home to his model trains, which are the only things that still produce in him anything resembling genuine enthusiasm. Number. Section 6. Behind the Curtain Writers, Voices, and the Making of the Show. Facts 151 through 180. Every episode of The Simpsons that has ever aired began as a conversation in a room. A group of writers sat down, and something came out of that room that eventually became part of the permanent record of American television. The process that produced those episodes is worth understanding. Fact 151. The Simpsons writing process begins with what the staff calls a table read, in which the current draft of a script is read aloud by writers and cast members together. Table reads often last several hours because the show has a culture of improvisation and interruption during them, with writers pitching alternative jokes or lines in real time as the script is read. By some accounts, the table read for a single episode can produce enough material for several episodes, most of which is never used. Fact 152. The show has had more than 200 writers across its run, and the culture of the writing room has changed significantly over the decades. The early seasons were characterized by an intensity and a willingness to take risks that the show's enormous success eventually made more complicated. When a show is a cultural institution, the pressure to protect what it is becomes as powerful as the pressure to grow, and navigating that tension has defined the show's creative trajectory since the mid-90s. Fact 153. John Swartzwelder, who wrote 59 episodes of The Simpsons between 1990 and 2003, is widely considered the show's single greatest writer. He wrote some of the most celebrated episodes in the show's history, including Deep Space Homer, Selma's Choice, Bart Gets Hit by a Car, and dozens of others. He left the show in 2003 when California's smoking ban made it impossible for him to write in his preferred coffee shop environment, and he has given essentially no interviews since. He remains a kind of legend within the show's mythology. Fact 154. Swartzwelder's writing style is characterized by a density of jokes that other writers have described as overwhelming. His scripts reportedly contained more jokes per page than any other writer on the staff, and many of those jokes were ideas that seemed impossible to execute until the animation team figured out how. His method was to write the funniest thing he could conceive of, and then let everyone else worry about whether it was producible. Fact 155. George Meyer, another legendary figure from the show's early writing staff, is credited by many former colleagues as the single most influential creative force in shaping the show's comedic philosophy. Meyer's contribution was less visible than Swartzwelder's in terms of individual episode credits, but more pervasive in terms of the show's overall sensibility, its willingness to be dark, its commitment to finding the most unexpected angle on any given premise, its hostility to easy sentiment. Fact 156. The animation for The Simpsons is produced in South Korea by studios that have changed over the decades, but have maintained a consistent working relationship with the American production team. The process of getting an episode from script to finished animation takes approximately 6 months, which means that episodes are always in production at multiple stages simultaneously. By the time an episode airs, the writers have been working on episodes that will air a year later. Fact 157. The Simpsons records its voice sessions in Los Angeles, typically with the cast reading together rather than individually. This ensemble approach, which dates from the show's earliest recordings, produces a chemistry between the characters that isolated recording cannot replicate. The cast has spoken about the sessions as genuinely pleasurable, a rare quality in a profession that often involves long stretches of solitary technical work. Fact 158. Dan Castellaneta initially pitched Homer's voice as a Walter Matthau impression before developing it into something more original. The Matthau quality is still audible in certain moments, particularly when Homer is being deliberately contemptuous or slow and deliberate in his speech, but the character has moved far enough from that starting point that the origin is mostly academic at this stage. Fact 159. Nancy Cartwright has said that voicing Bart involves a specific physicality that she has maintained across the entire run of the show. She leans forward when doing Bart's voice, engages her body in a way that ordinary conversational speech doesn't require, and has described the character as demanding a kind of energy that she has to actively generate rather than simply relax into. Bart is work in a way that some other characters aren't. Fact 160. The show's music is produced by a full orchestra, a luxury that most contemporary animated productions no longer afford. The music budget has been a point of pride for the show's producers, who have maintained that the presence of live instrumentation gives the show a warmth and spontaneity that synthesized music can't replicate. Alf Clausen composed and conducted the show's music for 27 seasons before being replaced by Bleeding Fingers music in 2017. Fact 161. Alf Clausen's dismissal after 27 years was handled without public explanation, which made it a subject of considerable discomfort in the show's fan community. Clausen had become so identified with the show's musical identity that his departure felt like the loss of something central, not just a personnel change. He has given brief interviews since his dismissal that expressed hurt without accusation, and the subject remains a slightly tender one for longtime fans of the show. Fact 162. The Simpsons has used real classical compositions, popular songs, and original compositions to such effect that its musical moments are among its most remembered. The show's use of music is sophisticated in a way that most animated programming is not, deploying specific pieces with an awareness of what they carry culturally and what they add to a given moment beyond their basic function as background sound. Fact 163. The show has been renewed repeatedly without the normal cycle of cancellation threat and last-minute reprieve that characterizes most long-running American television. Fox and the show's producers have negotiated extensions that have kept it running well beyond any conventional career arc, with deals that typically cover multiple seasons at once. The financial arrangements involved are substantial enough that The Simpsons is one of the most valuable entertainment properties in American media history. Fact 164. Harry Shearer had a public dispute with the show in 2015 that led briefly to the possibility of his departure. Shearer had expressed frustration with what he described as an inability to work on outside projects while under contract to the show. The dispute was resolved, and Shearer remained with the production. But the episode demonstrated that even after 25 years, the relationships between the show and its key cast members were not entirely uncomplicated. Fact 165. The show's animation style has evolved considerably over its run. The early seasons, produced by Klasky Csupo, have a slightly angular quality with rougher edges and more exaggerated expressions. Later seasons, produced by Film Roman and eventually other studios, have a smoother, more polished look. Fans have debated which era's animation is aesthetically superior for as long as there have been fan debates, and the conversation is unlikely to reach consensus. Fact 166. The Simpsons introduced a significant number of words and phrases into American English through repeated use within the show. Beyond dough, which made the dictionary, the show popularized or amplified meh as an expression of indifference, embiggen as a verb meaning to make larger, and cromulent as a mock formal adjective meaning acceptable or adequate. These last two came from a single episode and were intended as jokes, not as genuine contributions to the language, which makes their adoption into actual usage one of the more amusing, unintended consequences of the show's cultural reach. Fact 167. The show's approach to continuity has been described by its own producers as deliberate rather than careless. They know about the inconsistencies. They know that characters' ages don't add up, that locations change, that backstories contradict each other. The decision not to resolve these inconsistencies comes from a philosophy that treating them as problems to be fixed would require the kind of serialized storytelling that the show has always resisted. Each episode is meant to be complete in itself. Fact 168. The writer's room has a tradition of the pitch, in which any writer can interrupt a discussion to offer an alternative idea for a scene or a joke. The culture of the room is designed to be fast and freewheeling, and the expectation is that ideas will be generated in volume and filtered by collective response rather than by any individual's authority. This democratic chaos is credited by many former writers as the source of the show's characteristic unpredictability. Fact 169. Several Simpsons writers have gone on to create their own highly successful shows. Conan O'Brien, who wrote for the show in its third and fourth seasons, became a late-night television host. Greg Daniels, who worked on the writing staff, went on to create the American version of The Office and Parks and Recreation. David X. Cohen, another writer, became a key figure on Futurama alongside Matt Groening himself. Fact 170. The show has a tradition of staging elaborate fake-outs in episodes involving significant plot developments. The audience has come to expect that anything that looks like a permanent change to the status quo will be revealed as a dream, a fantasy, a simulation, or a deliberate misdirect. The show has used this expectation both to subvert audience suspicion and to occasionally deliver genuine changes in the middle of an episode when the audience has relaxed its guard. Fact 171. The show's guest star policy in the early seasons was considerably more restrictive than it became in later years. Early guest appearances tended to involve celebrities who had a specific reason to be in Springfield, whose presence served the story rather than simply the promotional value of having them. Later seasons have been more willing to use guest stars as an attraction in themselves, a shift that many critics have pointed to as a symptom of the show's broader creative evolution away from its original philosophy. Fact 172. The show has been produced under extreme time pressure from the very beginning. The combination of the long lead time required for animation and the traditional American television schedule means that episodes are almost always being completed at the last possible moment. Former writers have described the experience of finishing an episode while it was literally being prepared for broadcast, inserting final jokes into an episode that was simultaneously being duplicated for distribution. Fact 173. The Simpsons has a relationship with its own critics that is simultaneously antagonistic and deeply appreciative. When television critics turned against the show in the early 2000s and began declaring that it had passed its peak, the show responded by making episodes that directly addressed and mocked the critics who had made those declarations. This self-defensive humor became its own genre within the show, and the meta-commentary on the show's own decline became so embedded that it eventually transcended being a response and became a permanent layer of the show's identity. Fact 174. The table of contents for the show's production Bible, the document that guided the show's early development and established its characters, relationships, and tone, has never been officially published. Fragments have appeared in books and documentaries, but the full document remains a piece of television history that is not publicly accessible. Some of what it contained about character intentions has been contradicted so thoroughly by subsequent episodes that it would function more as an artifact of the show's origins than as a guide to what it became. Fact 175. The show employs a dedicated archivist whose job includes maintaining a complete record of every episode, every draft, every voice recording session, and every piece of production artwork from the show's entire run. The sheer volume of this archive is difficult to comprehend given how long the show has been running and how many individual assets each episode requires. It represents one of the largest archives of a single television property in the history of the medium. Fact 176. The show's international popularity has been one of its most consistent financial foundations. In many countries, The Simpsons was the first American animated show to find a mainstream primetime audience, and its success opened doors for other animated programs that followed. The show's ability to function across cultural contexts, its willingness to be dubbed and adapted rather than subtitled, made it accessible in ways that more culturally specific American entertainment wasn't. Fact 177. The writers have described working on The Simpsons as simultaneously the most creatively freeing and most creatively demanding experience of their professional lives. The show's combination of absolute creative latitude within each episode and the requirement to produce that latitude at scale, week after week, year after year, is a set of demands that most creative careers never encounter simultaneously. The best writers thrived on it. Others found it unsustainable. Fact 178. The show has been the subject of more academic analysis than virtually any other animated program. It has been discussed in books about economics, philosophy, political theory, cultural studies, religious studies, and linguistics. There are university courses dedicated to using the show as a primary text for examining American culture. The sophistication of this academic engagement would have seemed improbable when the show first aired, when it was widely regarded as a bit of subversive entertainment rather than a cultural document of lasting significance. Fact 179. The show's production office maintains a large physical space where writers work together in a room, a practice that has become increasingly unusual in an era when remote work has become standard in many industries. The Simpsons has maintained the physical writer's room as central to its creative process, and many former writers credit the in-person environment, the ability to read the room in real time, to see what makes people laugh and what makes them uncomfortable, as fundamental to the quality of the work the room produces. Fact 180. The show was animated for its first 3 seasons by Klasky Csupo, the same studio that would go on to create Rugrats and Real Monsters. The studio's founders, Gabor Csupo and Arlene Klasky, have spoken about the early Simpsons production as one of the most challenging and most formative experiences of their professional lives. The show was being invented as it was being made, which placed demands on everyone involved that nobody had been trained to meet because the kind of thing they were making had simply never been done before at that scale. Number. Section 7. The predictions, the coincidences, and the cultural fingerprint. Facts 181 through 210. The Simpsons has been credited with predicting the future so many times that the claim has become part of the show's mythology. Some of these predictions are extraordinary. Some are less remarkable than they appear. And the question of what it means that the show's satirical observations so often precede actual events is more interesting than it might initially seem. Fact 181. In the year 2000 episode titled Bart to the Future, the show depicted a future version of America in which Lisa Simpson is the country's first female president. Her predecessor, referenced explicitly in the episode, is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before the 2016 presidential election, in which Trump became the Republican nominee and ultimately the President of the United States. The writers had drawn on Trump's long-standing public flirtation with a presidential run, which dated back to the late 1980s. But the specificity of the prediction made it genuinely remarkable. Fact 182. The show's writers have generally been careful to describe this kind of prediction as extrapolation rather than foresight. Al Jean has said that the Trump prediction was not based on any particular belief that Trump would actually run and win, but rather on the observation that celebrity politics was a trajectory that American culture was already on, and that Trump was the most logical representative of that trajectory. The joke was about the direction, not the specific destination. Fact 183. In a 1995 episode, Homer uses a device that looks remarkably similar to a modern smartwatch, complete with a touchable screen and the ability to communicate at a distance. The show's depiction of wearable technology predates the first commercially available smartwatch by nearly 2 decades. The writers have said that this wasn't prediction so much as observation, since the idea of a wrist-mounted computer had been circulating in technology circles for years before the show depicted it. Fact 184. A 1998 episode depicted the Walt Disney Company acquiring 20th Century Fox. This actually happened in 2019, 21 years after the episode aired. By the time the deal was announced, it was covered extensively as a Simpsons prediction, despite the fact that the logic behind it, that media consolidation would inevitably lead to the largest entertainment companies consuming their competitors, was already evident to anyone paying attention to the industry in 1998. Fact 185. An episode from 1993 called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia that spreads to Springfield, causing the town to panic, to stockpile supplies, and to search frantically for a cure that doesn't materialize as quickly as anyone hopes. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic, and the parallels between its fictional outbreak and the real one were striking enough that clips from it circulated widely on social media in early 2020. Fact 186. In the same flu episode, the townspeople accidentally release a swarm of hornets while attempting to destroy the barrels containing what they believe to be a cure. This detail was widely shared in the spring of 2020 when Asian giant hornets, dubbed murder hornets by the media, appeared in Washington state, creating a brief secondary panic alongside the pandemic response. The coincidence of a fictional swarm and a real swarm appearing during otherwise similar circumstances was too neat to be believed, but it was real. Fact 187. A 1998 episode featured a joke in which Homer uses a calculator-like device to perform a calculation and arrives at the number 3 followed by many zeros. This was later connected by fans to work in physics and cosmology that predated the episode, but the specific alignment of the numbers prompted claims that the show had anticipated mathematical discoveries that hadn't yet been made. The show's mathematical advisor for that episode confirmed that the calculation was based on real mathematics that simply hadn't received public attention. Fact 188. The show predicted several developments in video gaming, including motion-controlled gameplay, massive multiplayer online games, and virtual reality interfaces, years before those technologies became commercially viable. Each of these was presented as a gag about the direction gaming was heading, and each was based on technology demonstrations and industry announcements that were already occurring in research environments, but hadn't yet reached consumer markets. Fact 189. The show depicted video calling technology in a 1995 episode as an obvious future development that the characters treated as unremarkable, in the way that science fiction often depicts future technology as ordinary by the time it exists. Video calling was not an entirely new concept in 1995, having been demonstrated at World's Fairs decades earlier, but the show's casual depiction of it as everyday technology predated its actual ubiquity by about 15 years. Fact 190. The show's most precise predictions tend to involve the entertainment industry rather than politics or technology, which makes sense given that the writers know that industry better than most. The show predicted, in various episodes, the rise of reality television, the consolidation of media ownership, the streaming revolution's impact on traditional broadcasting, and the decline of network television's cultural centrality. All of these were based on trends that were already visible to anyone paying close attention, but the show named them clearly before most public discussion had. Fact 191. Producer Bill Oakley has described the show's apparent predictive power as primarily a function of volume and confirmation bias. The show has produced hundreds of episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about American culture. Some of those observations will inevitably align with future events simply because the observations are about real trajectories that continue in the real world. The ones that align are noticed and remembered. The many more that don't align are simply forgotten. Fact 192. The show predicted the autocorrect phenomenon in a 1994 episode that depicted a handheld computing device misinterpreting handwriting input in spectacularly unhelpful ways. This was years before autocorrect was a widely used feature, and the show's depiction of it as an annoying failure mode rather than a useful tool has proved more prescient than any of its more celebrated political or technological predictions. Fact 193. A 2001 episode depicted a situation in which a character experiences the kind of surveillance culture that smartphones and social media would eventually make. Ordinary, with personal information being tracked, compiled, and used without the individual's awareness or consent. The show framed this as dystopian in 2001. By 2015, the same situation was simply Tuesday. Fact 194. The show has also made many predictions that did not come true. It predicted commercial jetpacks in widespread use by the early 2000s. It depicted flying cars as a near-future technology. It imagined a moon colony that operated as a tourist destination. None of these materialized. These failed predictions are not cited in the show's mythology of foresight because confirmation bias is a one-directional filter. The hits are remembered. The misses are invisible. Fact 195. The show's cultural influence on the predictions themselves is a factor that analysts have begun to take seriously. When a cultural phenomenon as large as The Simpsons depicts a future technology or political development, it creates a shared cultural image of that thing. Writers, engineers, politicians, and audiences who have absorbed that image carry it into their own decisions and creations. Some Simpsons predictions may have influenced the development of the things they depicted, making them less predictions than creative blueprints absorbed by the people who built what came after. Fact 196. The show's treatment of social media, which it depicted in various episodes before platforms like Facebook and Twitter existed, was mostly accurate about the psychological mechanics of the phenomenon, even when the specific technologies were different from what eventually emerged. The show understood, before the tools existed, that technology designed for communication would be used at least as much for performance and competition as for genuine connection. Fact 197. The Trump escalator descent, one of the most specific and visually detailed of the show's apparent predictions, appears in the 2000 episode alongside the prediction of his presidency. The sequence shows a future Trump descending to a formal announcement on an escalator, which matches the visual staging of his actual 2015 campaign announcement at Trump Tower almost precisely. The show's writers have said they have no explanation for this specificity beyond coincidence, which is either entirely true or entirely humble, depending on your interpretation. Fact 198. The show predicted the existence of a specific technology in medicine in a 1992 episode that depicted a medical scanner capable of performing what would now be described as a full-body MRI in seconds. The technology depicted was significantly beyond what was actually possible in 1992. And while similar but not identical technology has since been developed, the show's version remains more advanced than what currently exists. This is one of the few predictions where reality hasn't quite caught up to Springfield yet. Fact 199. The show's political satire is sometimes presented as prediction, when it is more accurately described as observation with a fast forward applied. When the show depicted corrupt municipal politics, voter apathy, the influence of money on elections, and the gap between political rhetoric and political reality, it was describing things that were already happening. The prediction was not about future events but about the continuation of present ones, which is a more modest but arguably more valuable form of foresight. Fact 200. The show itself has become self-aware about its predictive reputation. Episodes in later seasons have made jokes about the phenomenon, with characters commenting on the show's apparent ability to forecast events. The meta-awareness of the joke undercuts it and amplifies it simultaneously, which is very much in keeping with the show's general approach to its own mythology. Fact 201. A 2012 episode predicted the sale of an entertainment property that actually occurred in 2018. A 2010 episode depicted a sporting event result that came true exactly as depicted. A 2003 episode described a political development that occurred in 2014. The accumulation of these specific alignments has made the show's predictive reputation increasingly difficult to dismiss purely as confirmation bias. while remaining insufficient to prove any genuine foresight. Fact 202. The show has served as a kind of cultural pressure test for satirical ideas that later found their way into actual public discourse. Several episodes that were considered too dark or too exaggerated when they aired were later described as basically a documentary by viewers who encountered them after the events they'd satirized had occurred. This pattern of satirical exaggeration becoming realistic description is one of the more disquieting aspects of the show's long run. Fact 203. One of the show's most cited predictions involves a specific corporate acquisition in the technology sector that was depicted in an episode as a joke about monopolistic consolidation. The acquisition happened years later with almost exactly the financial and structural details the show had depicted as absurd. Whether this was prediction or simply a correct extrapolation of trends that were already visible in the industry is a question that the people who made the episode have declined to claim credit for. Fact 204. The show's writing staff has historically included people with backgrounds in fields outside entertainment, including science, law, mathematics, and political science. This diversity of expertise gives the staff access to expert knowledge about future trajectories in various fields that a writing room composed entirely of comedians or traditional television writers would not have. The show's predictions are therefore sometimes the product of genuine informed analysis rather than lucky guesses. Fact 205. The cultural weight of The Simpsons is now so substantial that politicians, public figures, and journalists regularly reference the show when discussing real events, often citing the show's version of a situation before citing the factual record. This has created a situation in which the show's satirical frame has become part of the interpretive apparatus that Americans use to understand their own political and cultural reality, which is a level of cultural influence that very few entertainment properties in any medium have achieved. Fact 206. The Simpsons has been used as a teaching tool in economics courses to illustrate concepts like price elasticity, labor markets, and externalities. The show's treatment of Burns's monopoly over Springfield's power supply, in particular, has been cited in academic papers on the economics of natural monopolies and regulatory capture. The show didn't intend to write economics textbooks, but the precision of its satire has made the material pedagogically useful. Fact 207. The show's depiction of media manipulation, in episodes that show characters controlling the press, fabricating stories, and managing public perception through television broadcasts, anticipated the way that social media and partisan news would eventually make media manipulation both more powerful and more transparent. The specific tools the show depicted were different from what emerged, but the mechanics were the same. Fact 208. A 2013 episode predicted the outcome of a sporting event in another country with enough specificity that local newspapers ran stories asking how the show's writers had known. The producers have never explained this one, either because the explanation is genuinely boring or because the mystery is more interesting than the truth. Given the show's approach to its own mythology, the latter is entirely possible. Fact 209. The show's prediction of the streaming revolution, depicted in an episode as a future in which people watch entertainment on demand on personal devices and pay subscription fees to access content, was made when network television was still dominant, and the specific technology required for streaming didn't yet exist in commercially viable form. The show treated it as a likely direction rather than an inevitable one, which turned out to be slightly too cautious. Fact 210. The show has been more consistently accurate in its predictions about culture than about technology or politics, which makes sense because cultural change tends to be driven by human psychology, which the show has always understood better than any other aspect of the world it depicts. What people want, how they behave when they get it, and what they sacrifice to get it are questions the show has been answering with remarkable consistency for 36 years. Number. Section 8. The Golden Age episodes that changed television. Facts 211 through 240. The Simpsons' Golden Age, which most analysts place between its third and eighth seasons, produced episodes that changed what television animation was capable of. These are the episodes that the show's reputation rests on, the ones that are still discussed in terms usually reserved for film or literature. Fact 211. The episode Last Exit to Springfield, which aired in the show's fourth season, has been called by many critics and writers the greatest episode of the show's entire run. It involves Homer becoming the union president at the nuclear plant in order to protect the family's dental plan so that Lisa can get braces. The episode manages to be simultaneously a sharp satire of labor relations, a parody of The Godfather, and a genuinely moving story about a father's love for his daughter. It does all of this in 22 minutes. Fact 212. Marge vs. The Monorail, written by Conan O'Brien in the show's 4th season, is the episode most frequently cited by Simpsons writers as the platonic ideal of what the show could do. It is a sustained parody of The Music Man that never loses its comedic momentum for a single moment, while also functioning as a surprisingly precise critique of civic credulity and the way charismatic salesmanship can bypass ordinary, critical thinking. Leonard Nimoy's cameo, in which he's unable to explain why he was in the episode, is one of the show's finest jokes. Fact 213. Homer the Great, in which Homer discovers a secret society called the Stonecutters and discovers that he is their prophesied leader, is one of the show's most perfectly constructed single-episode arcs. It builds from a small premise to an enormous absurdity with complete internal logic at every step, and the resolution, in which Homer's leadership of the Stonecutters is so oriented toward genuine good that the members immediately abandon him to form a new secret society that excludes him, is both a perfect joke and a precise observation about human nature. Fact 214. The episode You Only Move Twice, in which Homer gets a new dream job working for a globe-trotting supervillain named Hank Scorpio, while the rest of the family adjusts poorly to a perfect new life, is one of the show's most beloved episodes and one of its most unusual. Hank Scorpio, voiced by Albert Brooks, is the most genuinely likable villain in the show's history, a man whose world domination project doesn't diminish his warmth as an employer or his genuine concern for Homer's happiness. The episode ends with Homer giving up paradise because his family is miserable in it. Fact 215. Homer's Enemy, which aired in the show's 8th season, is often discussed as the episode that most directly confronted the premise of the show itself. Frank Grimes, a man who has earned everything through years of hard work, cannot comprehend a world that rewards Homer for doing nothing. The episode refuses to provide any comfort to either the audience or to Frank Grimes, and it ends with Frank's death going unmourned by the town, whose values he was trying to hold to account. It is the darkest episode of the show's golden age. Fact 216. Lisa's Substitute, in which Lisa develops a deep attachment to a substitute teacher named Mr. Bergstrom, who sees her potential and encourages it before he has to leave Springfield, is the episode most frequently cited by fans as making them cry for the first time. Mr. Bergstrom, voiced by Dustin Hoffman, who worked under a pseudonym, writes Lisa a note that she discovers is simply the words, "You are Lisa Simpson." The simplicity of the message and the weight the episode has given it by that point makes the scene genuinely devastating. Fact 217. Cape Fear, in which Sideshow Bob is released from prison and attempts to kill Bart while living under the Simpsons' boat, is one of the show's finest exercises in sustained comic timing. The sequence in which Bob steps repeatedly on rakes, each step producing the same loud smack, was extended well beyond what any conventional comedy would attempt, reaching a length where the joke transcends what it's doing and becomes something stranger and more hypnotic. The writers have said that the rake sequence was always much shorter in the script, and that the decision to extend it as long as it runs was made in production. Fact 218. Deep Space Homer, in which Homer is recruited by NASA to make space travel seem exciting to an indifferent public, contains the sequence that many fans consider the show's single greatest visual joke. Homer accidentally releases a bag of chips in microgravity, and the chips float in a formation that mimics the famous ballet sequence from 2001, A Space Odyssey, set to the same classical music. The joke works on multiple levels simultaneously and rewards knowledge of the film it's referencing, while also being funny to anyone who doesn't recognize it. Fact 219. The Boy Who Knew Too Much, in which Bart skips school and witnesses an event that becomes relevant to a high-profile trial, is one of the show's most efficient constructions. Every element of the episode exists to serve the plot, which is unusually disciplined for a show that typically layers its stories with tangential gags and digressions. The episode's tight structure was noticed by critics as evidence of what the show could do when it chose to be precise. Fact 220. Who Shot Mr. Burns, the two-part episode that aired at the end of Season 6 and the beginning of Season 7, represented something genuinely unprecedented in animated television. The show created a mystery with real dramatic stakes, invited the audience to participate in solving it, generated national media coverage, and then provided an answer that, whatever its satisfactions or frustrations, had to contend with the expectations that the promotion had created. No animated show had attempted anything like it before, and none has replicated it since. Fact 221. 22 short films about Springfield, one of the most formally experimental episodes in the show's run, dedicated itself to brief vignettes about Springfield's supporting characters rather than following the main family. The episode was a structural departure from the show's standard approach and demonstrated that the world of Springfield was rich enough to sustain episodes in which Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were either peripheral or absent entirely. Fact 222. Treehouse of Horror 5, from the show's 6th season, is generally considered the finest of the Halloween specials. It contains The Shining, a parody of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, in which Homer descends into violence without the hotel's supernatural prompting, Time and Punishment, in which Homer travels back in time in a toaster and keeps accidentally altering history, and Nightmare Cafeteria, in which the school's lunch problem is resolved by eating the students. Each segment is perfectly constructed, and together they represent the Halloween format at its most confident. Fact 223. The episode And Maggie Makes Three, a flashback episode depicting the circumstances of Maggie's conception and birth, ends with a reveal that has been cited repeatedly as among the most quietly moving moments in American television. Homer, we learn, had achieved his dream of working at a bowling alley. When Marge became pregnant with Maggie, he had to give it up and return to the power plant. Burns, in a moment of deliberate cruelty, hung a motivational sign where Homer could see it that read, "Don't forget, you're here forever." Homer, we learn, has papered the sign over with photographs of Maggie, so that it now reads, "Do it for her." The episode ends on this image, and there is nothing more to say. Fact 224. Homer's phobia, in which Homer befriends a gay antique dealer and then panics when he suspects Bart might be gay, is considered groundbreaking for its time. The episode won an Emmy and was praised for treating both Homer's homophobia and its resolution with more nuance than most primetime television of the era was willing to apply to the subject. John Waters, who voiced the antique dealer, has said that working on the episode was one of his most satisfying professional experiences. Fact 225. The episode El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer, in which Homer eats extremely spicy chili at a chili cook-off and hallucinates an encounter with a spirit guide, is the show at its most formally ambitious. The episode uses animation to explore an interior psychological and spiritual experience rather than simply a physical one, and the visuals produced during Homer's vision quest are some of the most distinctive and beautiful the show has ever generated. Fact 226. Bart on the Road, in which Bart and three friends take a road trip using a forged driver's license, while Lisa secretly monitors them through a situation involving a nuclear plant, is one of the show's great structural achievements. The episode manages three separate storylines simultaneously, each with its own comic rhythm, and brings them together in a resolution that satisfies all three without sacrificing any of them. The writing precision required to achieve this is considerable. Fact 227. The episode Lisa the Vegetarian, in which Paul and Linda McCartney guest star and Lisa commits permanently to vegetarianism, is unusual in the show's history for being a character change that actually stuck. Most changes in Lisa's life in any given episode are reversed by the next episode. Vegetarianism was different because Paul McCartney's agreement to appear was conditional on its permanence. The episode handles the ethical arguments around vegetarianism with more fairness than a pure advocacy piece would, giving Homer's perspective genuine weight before the episode settles on Lisa's choice. Fact 228. Mother Simpson, which reunites Homer with his living mother after a lifetime of believing she was dead, is the episode most frequently cited when people describe the show making them cry as adults. The episode earns its emotion honestly, building through comedy and revelation and reunion, before arriving at a farewell scene in which Homer stands on a hilltop and watches his mother's car disappear into the distance. The 40 seconds of silence over that image represent the show's most powerful use of restraint. Fact 229. Homer Badman, in which Homer is falsely accused of sexual harassment after a misunderstanding involving a gummy bear, was a remarkably prescient episode about media narratives, the speed with which public opinion forms around incomplete information, and the helplessness of an individual caught in a story that has already decided what he is. The episode aired in 1994 and anticipated dynamics that would become defining features of social media discourse decades later. Fact 230. King-size Homer, in which Homer deliberately gains weight to qualify for disability status and work from home, contains some of the show's finest physical comedy. Homer's escalating weight, the creative ways he finds to avoid movement, and the disaster he causes while trying to prevent a nuclear meltdown from the comfort of a phone at his kitchen are executed with perfect timing. The episode also, in its quieter moments, says something real about the appeal of opting out of a life that makes unreasonable demands. Fact 231. Much Apu About Nothing, in which Springfield debates a ballot measure targeting immigrants, is one of the show's most directly political episodes and one of its most emotionally charged. Apu's fear of deportation and the community's casual willingness to scapegoat him for problems he didn't cause is handled with a seriousness that sits slightly uncomfortably inside the episode's comedic framework, which is precisely the point. The show wanted the discomfort to be felt. Fact 232. The episode Homerpalooza, in which Homer finds unexpected success as a freak attraction at a music festival by catching cannonballs with his stomach, is one of the great portraits of middle-age displacement. Homer's anguished recognition that he no longer understands the music his culture considers cool is played as comedy but sits on top of something genuinely melancholy about the experience of growing older in a world that is always regenerating itself around you and leaving you slightly behind. Fact 233. Behind the Laughter, the 12th season mockumentary episode presented in the style of a VH1 Behind the Music documentary, is one of the show's most meta exercises. It presented the Simpson family as a real entertainment dynasty who were performing their lives for television, complete with allegations of drug use, financial disputes, and creative tension. The episode is simultaneously a parody of celebrity documentaries and a genuine piece of self-examination about what the show has become. Fact 234. The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson. The first episode of the show's 9th season brought Homer and the family to New York City for an extended sequence that served as a love letter to the city's particular brand of overwhelming intensity. The episode is notable for having aired as the 2000th episode of the show and for containing numerous details about New York that the writers had clearly researched thoroughly and then filtered through the show's specifically exaggerated lens. Fact 235. The episode Stark Raving Dad, the Season 3 premiere, guest-starred Michael Jackson under the pseudonym John J. Smith. Jackson provided the voice for a large white man who claims to be Michael Jackson and who helps Homer communicate better with Bart. The episode contains the song Happy Birthday, Lisa, which Jackson composed, and which is one of the most genuinely touching pieces of music the show has ever used. After Jackson's death, the episode was briefly made available again before being pulled in 2019, following the documentary Leaving Neverland. Fact 236. Lisa's Wedding, which depicts a flash forward to Lisa's adult life and her engagement to a British man who doesn't quite understand her family, is the show's first and most emotionally realized vision of what its characters might become. The episode ends with Lisa in the present, having been shown a possible future that the fortune teller who showed it to her tells her is only possible if she chooses it. It's a meditation on the relationship between who we are and who we might become that works because the show has spent enough time with Lisa that we can feel the stakes. Fact 237. Two Bad Neighbors, in which former President George H.W. Bush moves into the house across from The Simpsons, was based on an actual public dispute between Bush and the show. Bush had, in a 1992 speech, called for American families to be more like the Waltons and less like The Simpsons. The show responded by having Bart vandalize the president's memoirs and by staging an escalating conflict between Homer and Bush that ends with Gerald Ford restoring the peace over football and nachos. Fact 238. The episode Summer of 4 Feet 2, in which Lisa reinvents herself over the summer and discovers the pleasures of being liked by people who don't know her, is one of the show's most sympathetic portraits of its most sympathetic character. Lisa's summer transformation and her terror of returning to the identity she has at home are real teenage experiences given animated form, and the episode's resolution, in which her new friends inscribe a message on a beachside rock that tells her they know who she really is the show being unexpectedly gentle with a character it usually puts through more resistance. Fact 239. The Itchy and Scratchy Movie, in which Bart is denied permission to see the most eagerly anticipated film of the decade as punishment for his behavior, contains a flash forward to the future in which Homer and Bart watch the film together as old men. The future version of the scene is not played for comedy. Homer and an aged Bart sit side by side and share a laugh. And the image of Homer still alive, still watching cartoons with his son decades later, is one of the show's most unexpectedly sweet visions of the future it will never show again. Fact 240. Homer the Smithers, in which Homer is assigned to care for Mr. Burns while Smithers takes a vacation and must learn to anticipate Burns's every need, is one of the show's finest character studies of both Homer and Burns. The episode reveals what Burns is like without Smithers's mediating influence: helpless, confused, and genuinely frightened in a way that his usual armor of wealth and contempt conceals. The episode humanizes Burns more effectively in 22 minutes than several more explicitly dramatic episodes had managed. Number. Section 9. The guest stars, the feuds, and the controversies. Facts 241 through 270. The Simpsons has attracted virtually every significant figure in American popular culture at some point across its run. Not all of those relationships went smoothly. The show's history is punctuated by memorable collaborations and equally memorable disputes. Fact 241. The show's most beloved guest performance is widely considered to be Dustin Hoffman's appearance as Mr. Bergstrom in Lisa's Substitute, which he did under the pseudonym Sam Ettick. Hoffman reportedly took the role because his children were fans of the show and asked him to do it, and he threw himself into the performance with the same commitment he brought to his film work. The character of Mr. Bergstrom has been cited by Lisa's voice actress Yeardley Smith as one of her favorite episodes to record. Fact 242. Albert Brooks has appeared in the show 3 times, in different roles across different seasons, and each performance is considered among the finest in the show's guest star history. His portrayal of Hank Scorpio in You Only Move Twice is particularly celebrated for the specificity of the character's warmth and the commitment with which Brooks played a genuinely nice supervillain. Brooks improvised extensively during his recording sessions, and much of what made Scorpio memorable came from material that wasn't in the original script. Fact 243. The show's feud with the country of Brazil was triggered by a 1999 episode in which the family travels to Rio de Janeiro and the city is depicted as dangerous, chaotic, and crawling with monkeys. The Brazilian government and the Brazilian tourism industry both issued formal protests. Fox apologized. The show then aired a parody of the apology that extended the joke rather than genuinely resolving it, which did not help relations with the Brazilian government. Fact 244. The show's relationship with Australia was tested by a 2020 episode in which Homer accidentally creates a massive cane toad infestation in the country. The cane toad is a real environmental catastrophe in Australia, introduced to the country by humans in the 1930s and still causing ecological damage today, so the episode touched a nerve that the writers may not have fully anticipated. Australian viewers responded with a mixture of genuine offense and the kind of self-deprecating humor that Australians tend to deploy about their own national disasters. Fact 245. Michael Jackson's contribution to the show remains one of its most discussed and most complicated chapters. Jackson recorded his lines under a pseudonym, and the show refused for years to confirm or deny his involvement. After his death in 2009, the producers finally confirmed that the voice was Jackson's. Following the release of the documentary Leaving Neverland in 2019, the episode Stark Raving Dad was pulled from circulation by the producers, who said they felt it was the right thing to do. Fact 246. George Harrison appeared in the show as himself, meeting Homer in a fantasy sequence related to Homer's brief career as a music producer. Harrison, by all accounts, approached the role with complete sincerity and took it seriously in the way that he took most things seriously, including work that others might have considered trivial. Harrison died in 2001, and his episode is now one of a number in the show's archive that serves as an accidental memorial. Fact 247. The show's feud with George Bush the Elder was one of its most publicly visible controversies. After Bush's 1992 speech, calling for families to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons, Bart was given a line in the following week's episode in which he said that the Simpsons were just like the Waltons, since both families were praying for the end of the Depression. The exchange escalated until both sides had addressed the other through their respective public platforms, with the show ultimately addressing it through the episode Two Bad Neighbors. Fact 248. Leonard Nimoy's appearances on the show are remembered with particular fondness for the quality of his self-awareness. Nimoy was willing to make himself the object of the joke in ways that many celebrities find uncomfortable, particularly in Marge vs. The Monorail, where his inability to explain his own presence in the episode is one of the funniest moments of his entire guest appearance. Nimoy seemed genuinely amused by the show's willingness to use him as a prop rather than a draw. Fact 249. The show's treatment of religion has generated controversy on multiple occasions. Various religious organizations have objected to specific episodes over the show's run, with the Catholic League and various Protestant groups issuing statements of protest at various points. The show has addressed Christian practice, Jewish faith, Buddhism, Hinduism, and various other religious traditions across its run with varying degrees of reverence and irreverence, and its willingness to poke fun at organized religion while maintaining genuine respect for private faith has made its relationship with religious controversy consistently complicated. Fact 250. A 1994 episode that depicted the legality of homosexuality in Canada generated a complaint from a Canadian government official who objected to the implication that Canada needed to specify the legality of things that were matters of ongoing debate in the United States. The complaint was framed as humorless by the show's writers at the time, though the underlying point about the episode's assumptions about Canadian law was actually accurate. Fact 251. The show's guest star list includes several people who appear as themselves in episodes where they are killed. This is a specific subset of guest appearance that the show has used occasionally, and that requires a particular willingness from the celebrity to participate in their own fictional death. It tends to generate significant publicity, which is presumably part of the appeal for both the show and the celebrity involved. Fact 252. Johnny Cash voiced the spirit of a coyote that guides Homer during his vision quest in El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer. Cash was in his late 60s at the time of the recording, and his voice had the particular quality of someone who has been through enough of the world that they can play the mystical without seeming to reach for it. The recording is considered one of the finest in the show's guest star history, and the episode is dedicated to Cash's memory after his death in 2003. Fact 253. The show's involvement with professional wrestling has generated one of its most memorable and most criticized guest appearances. In an episode that brought several professional wrestlers into Springfield, the show's depiction of the sport was criticized by fans for missing the point of what they valued about wrestling, which was a common complaint about how mainstream entertainment handled the subject during that period. Fact 254. Stephen Hawking appeared in the show multiple times and has described it as one of his most enjoyable creative experiences outside of his scientific work. Hawking seemed genuinely delighted by the show's willingness to treat him as both a brilliant scientist and a figure capable of physical comedy, and he engaged with the joke of his own persona with an ease that made his appearances among the most charming in the show's history. Fact 255. The show's relationship with the country of Japan has been one of its most extensive and most involved. Japan has been depicted in multiple episodes, and the show's popularity in Japan is substantial enough that a dedicated Japanese fan community has produced significant scholarship and fan art around the show's Japanese episodes specifically. The show's ability to acknowledge and incorporate its own international reception has been one of its more sophisticated cultural moves. Fact 256. The controversy around the Apu character, which erupted following the 2017 documentary The Problem with Apu, forced a public conversation about representation in animation that the show had avoided for nearly 30 years. The show's initial response to the documentary was widely criticized as dismissive and the subsequent handling of the character has been cited as an example of the difficulty of changing something as embedded as a beloved character when the character embodies assumptions that turned out to be harmful. Fact 257. Ringo Starr appeared in an episode in which he receives a fan letter from Marge that she wrote in the 1960s, and that took decades to be delivered. The episode played on Starr's reputation as the slightly overlooked Beatle, and Starr was gracious enough about the premise to commit to the self-deprecation it required. The episode is a fan favorite partly because of how generous Starr's performance is. Fact 258. The show's treatment of the Super Bowl, which it has addressed in several episodes including a Super Bowl halftime episode broadcast during the Super Bowl itself, has generated controversy on at least 2 occasions for jokes that crossed lines defined by the network or the NFL. The tension between the show's characteristic irreverence and the particular conservatism of Super Bowl broadcast standards has made Super Bowl-adjacent episodes some of the most politically negotiated in the show's production history. Fact 259. Several celebrities have declined invitations to appear on the show on principled grounds. Some found the show's humor too dark. Others objected to the specific role they were offered. A small number have objected to the show's political satire in a general way that made any collaboration feel like an endorsement they weren't comfortable giving. The show has been respectful of these refusals, and the identities of those who declined have mostly remained private. Fact 260. Elvis Costello, Tom Waits, Amy Mann, and Beck all appeared in the same episode, Deep Space Homer. Wait, this is incorrect. They appeared in the episode Homerpalooza, performing at a music festival. Each brought a version of their public persona to the episode that was slightly heightened in exactly the right direction for comedy, and the episode became a minor artifact of mid-90s alternative rock culture as a result. Fact 261. The show's relationship with the British cultural establishment was complicated by an episode in which Monty Python's Terry Jones appeared and several jokes were made, at the expense of British comedy traditions. Jones, to his enormous credit, seemed entirely comfortable with this arrangement, which is perhaps the most Monty Python way to respond to jokes at Monty Python's expense. Fact 262. Mel Gibson appeared in an episode centered on his collaboration with Homer on a remake of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Gibson's willingness to parody his own earnestness and his public image as a sincere believer in heroic values made for one of the show's more interesting celebrity commentaries of the late 90s. The episode aired before the various personal controversies that reshaped Gibson's public image in the following decade. Fact 263. The show received a letter from a real-life town named Springfield, located in a state whose identity the letter writer pointedly did not confirm, claiming that the fictional Springfield was based on their town. The show's response acknowledged the letter warmly and declined to confirm or deny the identification, which was precisely the response that kept the geographic mystery alive while also charming the letter writer. Fact 264. A 2004 episode involving a storyline about gay marriage generated the largest volume of viewer complaints the show had received up to that point. The episode depicted the legalization of gay marriage in Springfield and Homer's subsequent career as a wedding officiant. Several affiliates declined to air the episode. Fox aired it anyway, and the episode's ratings were among the season's highest. Fact 265. Bob Hope appeared in an episode late in his life and career in which he played himself making his final USO tour. Hope was in his late 90s at the time of the recording and was in declining health. The episode treats his age and his legacy with genuine warmth rather than comedy, which was unusual for the show's approach to its guest stars, and reflected the particular affection the writers and producers had for Hope's legacy. Fact 266. The show's feud with Bart Simpson himself, which took the form of several episodes in which Bart was diminished as a character while other family members were developed, was noticed and commented upon by Nancy Cartwright in various interviews. Cartwright has spoken about the experience of watching Bart become less central to the show's storytelling as the show matured, and about the particular challenge of maintaining the energy of a character whose defining trait is youth and mischief across 3 decades of consistent performance. Fact 267. Several episodes have featured satire of specific real celebrities that was pointed enough to generate legal threats if not actual lawsuits. The show has generally prevailed in these situations on the grounds that satire of public figures is protected expression, But the legal process of defending that protection has occasionally been expensive and time-consuming enough that the show's producers have said it has influenced their decisions about the targets of specific jokes. Fact 268. The episode that most directly satirized Fox News, its parent network, was cleared for broadcast after what some writers have described as significant internal discussion. The show's ability to satirize the network that broadcasts it has always been a unique feature of its situation, one that Fox has occasionally restricted and occasionally permitted in ways that the show has never fully explained publicly. Fact 269. The show's treatment of immigration across its run has generated controversy from multiple directions simultaneously, with some critics arguing that certain episodes were too sympathetic to undocumented immigrants and others arguing that the same episodes weren't sympathetic enough. Navigating immigration as a subject in comedy requires a precision that the show has not always achieved perfectly, and the episodes that deal with it directly are among the show's most debated. Fact 270. The guest star tradition reached a particular peak in the early 2000s, when it became clear that appearing on The Simpsons had become a specific kind of cultural achievement that celebrities pursued deliberately. The volume of guest star requests coming into the show exceeded the show's capacity to accommodate them, and the writers began making stricter decisions about which appearances would serve stories and which were purely promotional, a distinction that had always been part of the show's philosophy, but that the volume of demand made harder to enforce. Number. Section 10. Springfield's Hidden World Easter Eggs, Callbacks, and Buried Details. Facts 271 through 300. The Simpsons rewards close attention in ways that casual viewing never reveals. 36 years of episodes have accumulated an architecture of Easter eggs, callbacks, and buried references that functions as a parallel text underneath the show's surface. This is where that text lives. Fact 271. The show has hidden the number 731 in the background of numerous episodes. 731 was the number of The Office that several key writers shared during the show's early seasons, and embedding it in background details of episodes became a recurring tradition that has continued long after those writers moved on. Finding 731 in a Simpsons episode has become a specific sport for particularly dedicated viewers. Fact 272. The Simpsons has a tradition of foreshadowing major plot points within the opening sequence of the episode in which they occur. Careful viewers have noted that background details visible during the couch gag or the family's drive home often contain visual references to the episode's story that are only recognizable after the episode has been seen. The show places these details for the replay, for the viewer who comes back to the episode knowing what happens and wants to find the evidence that it was always coming. Fact 273. Bleeding Gums Murphy, the jazz saxophonist who mentors Lisa and whose death in a later episode is one of the show's most affecting moments, is connected to Dr. Hibbert, Springfield's pediatrician, through a detail that the show establishes and never explains. The two men are implied to be brothers who were separated in childhood and never reconnected. The show drops this detail without drawing attention to it, and whether the writers intended to develop it or simply planted it as a texture is not publicly known. Fact 274. The Simpsons universe contains, in the background of various episodes, references to events and characters from other episodes that the main plot never acknowledges. Small visual details establish the continuity of minor storylines from previous episodes. A sign in the background of one episode will refer to an event from 3 seasons earlier. A character visible in a crowd scene will be wearing something that callbacks to their last appearance many episodes ago. These details require an encyclopedic knowledge of the show to catch and reward the viewers who have it. Fact 275. The show's depiction of television within the show, particularly Itchy and Scratchy, the Tom and Jerry parody that is Bart and Lisa's favorite cartoon, has its own internal continuity that tracks across the show's run. Itchy and Scratchy storylines change, the characters evolve within their own fictional show, and the history of Itchy and Scratchy as a cultural institution within Springfield has been developed in enough detail that it functions as a complete satire of American animation history embedded inside an animated show. Fact 276. The Krusty the Clown television show, which exists within the Springfield universe as a significant piece of local media, has its own recurring cast, its own production history, and its own backstage dynamics that the show has explored in several episodes. Krusty's show has had sidekicks, guest stars, production scandals, and ratings crises that mirror the histories of real children's television programs in ways that reward knowledge of that history. Fact 277. The Simpsons has used the chalkboard gag to respond to real-world events in real time. When significant things happen in the world between the writing of an episode's script and its broadcast, the chalkboard gag, which is among the last elements added to a production, can be updated to address current events. Several chalkboard gags have served as the show's commentary on things that happened too recently to be incorporated into the main story. Fact 278. The show has hidden caricatures of its own writers and producers in background crowd scenes across its run. These cameos are not publicly announced and require specific knowledge of what the show's creative team looks like to identify. Finding them is a specific area of focus for the show's most dedicated fans, and the list of confirmed hidden cameos has grown considerably as streaming platforms have made pausing and zooming into background scenes practical. Fact 279. The couch gag has been contributed by outside animators and filmmakers on several occasions, including a celebrated gag by the graffiti artist Banksy and another by the filmmaker Guillermo del Toro. These outside contributions tend to be among the most elaborate and most discussed couch gags in the show's history, and they function as the show extending its hand to the wider creative community and inviting a collaboration that produces something neither party could have made alone. Fact 280. Banksy's couch gag, which aired in 2010, depicted the animation production process itself as a sweatshop operation, with underpaid workers producing cells in terrible conditions, while a stuffed animal had its horn cut off and a cat was used to seal the DVDs. The gag was simultaneously a commentary on global manufacturing practices and a piece of self-criticism from a show that is aware of how its own production works. Fox's decision to air it was itself a notable editorial choice. Fact 281. The show has referenced its own cancellation multiple times, in episodes and in couch gags that acknowledge the possibility that the show could end. These self-aware moments function as the show processing anxiety about its own longevity in the only way it knows how, through comedy, while also implicitly acknowledging that it has outlasted most assessments of how long it could reasonably run. Fact 282. Several episodes contain deliberate anachronisms, objects or references that appear in the wrong time period. These are sometimes errors and sometimes deliberate jokes, and distinguishing between them requires knowledge of what the show intended and what it achieved. The show's writers have acknowledged that at this point, with hundreds of episodes and thousands of details, some of what appears to be intentional is accidental and vice versa. Fact 283. The show's depiction of Springfield's geography has been analyzed in enough detail that fan-made maps have been produced attempting to reconcile all the show's various geographic claims into a single, coherent layout. These maps always fail to reconcile everything because the show has never been consistent enough for a single map to accommodate all the evidence. The maps are nonetheless beautiful objects, detailed works of fan scholarship that speak to the depth of investment people bring to Springfield. Fact 284. The Shelbyville rivalry. Springfield's long-standing competition with the neighboring town of Shelbyville has produced some of the show's most effective world-building. The rivalry is established as ancient, petty, and completely asymmetrical in the importance each town places on it. Springfield is obsessed with Shelbyville. Shelbyville is barely aware that Springfield's feelings are as intense as they are. The dynamic mirrors any number of real-world small-town rivalries and gives Springfield a context for its own identity that exists outside the show's main stories. Fact 285. The episode Lemon of Troy, in which Bart leads a group of Springfield children on a mission to recover a stolen lemon tree from Shelbyville, is a fan favorite partly because it commits completely to treating the recovery of a fruit tree as a matter of genuine civic honor. The episode's willingness to take the mission seriously, to give it the weight of a real quest while acknowledging that it's also absurd, is one of the show's finest deployments of its particular brand of mock-epic storytelling. Fact 286. The treehouse that Bart uses as a base of operations appears in numerous episodes but has different interior configurations in different stories. The treehouse represents a consistent symbolic space, Bart's domain above the adult world, even when its physical details don't entirely add up. The inconsistency is the show acknowledging that the meaning of the space matters more than its exact dimensions. Fact 287. The show has embedded references to literary works, films, and musical compositions in ways that are visible to viewers familiar with those works and invisible to those who aren't. Episodes have contained allusions to everything from Dickens to Bergman to Wagner to Borges, placed not as show-off moves but as genuine responses to the material the episode was processing. The range of cultural reference in the show's library of episodes is extraordinary, given its format and its audience. Fact 288. The school buses at Springfield Elementary all have names, visible in background shots, that are typically the names of real educators, politicians, or cultural figures relevant to education policy at the time the episodes were produced. These details are invisible at normal viewing speed and require the kind of frame-by-frame attention that the show's original creators couldn't have expected viewers to apply. They exist purely for the show's own amusement, planted as jokes that the show itself was the only one likely to get. Fact 289. The show has produced episodes that function as complete genre parodies, mimicking the conventions of specific film and television formats so precisely that viewers familiar with those formats get a qualitatively different experience than those who aren't. The show's noir episode, its musical episode, its horror episodes, and its documentary episode all work as comedy for general audiences and as something richer for those who know the specific conventions being deployed. Fact 290. The Simpsons Bible, the document that established the show's world before its premiere, specified that Springfield's location should never be revealed. This instruction has been honored in spirit even when it has been violated in individual episodes, because the violation is always immediately undermined by subsequent episodes that contradict it. The location mystery is one of the show's most carefully maintained institutional commitments, honored not through any single decision but through the collective understanding of what the mystery is worth. Fact 291. The show has used its international broadcast to embed jokes for specific regional audiences that are invisible to American viewers. Episodes broadcast in certain countries contain brief additions or substitutions that acknowledge local cultural context in ways that general audiences wouldn't notice. This practice of customizing content for specific audiences is not widely discussed publicly and is something the show has never advertised. Fact 292. The Simpsons has a tradition of episodes that take place entirely or primarily in a single location. These bottle episodes, which constrain the story to a specific physical space, tend to be among the show's most precisely written because the limitation forces a concentration of character and situation that more expansive episodes can avoid through narrative movement. The best bottle episodes are among the show's finest achievements. Fact 293. The show's treatment of death, across the many episodes in which significant or beloved characters have died, has been more consistently thoughtful than the show's comedic reputation might suggest. Deaths in the show tend to be handled with a restraint that acknowledges their weight even when the episodes surrounding them continue to be comedic. The show doesn't deny that death is serious. It simply refuses to make seriousness the only permissible response to it. Fact 294. The Simpsons has referenced every major category of philosophical thought at some point across its run, sometimes through extended parody, sometimes through a single line in a conversation, sometimes through visual gag that contains a philosophical point if you're paying close enough attention. The show's relationship with ideas has always been simultaneously serious and irreverent, treating philosophy as too important to be solemn about and too interesting to be ignored. Fact 295. The show's approach to technology has tracked the actual development of American consumer technology with some fidelity, updating the devices and platforms that characters use as those devices and platforms changed in the real world. Homer's phone went from a wall-mounted kitchen unit to a mobile phone to a smartphone across the show's run, and each transition happened at roughly the same pace it was happening in American households. This attentiveness to technological change is part of what has allowed the show to feel contemporary even in its later seasons. Fact 296. The show has a tradition of final shots that sit a beat longer than necessary, letting the image breathe before the credits roll. This is a directorial choice that the show has deployed consistently, and that gives its quieter endings a particular quality, a sense that the show is asking you to sit with what you've seen rather than rushing you toward the next thing. In a medium defined by its resistance to pause, these moments of deliberate duration have a disproportionate effect. Fact 297. The Simpsons has been the target of plagiarism claims on multiple occasions, usually from individuals who claim that a specific episode concept was stolen from their work. The show has defended against these claims consistently, and in most cases, the similarity between the episode and the claimed source was either coincidental or the result of both drawing on the same common cultural material. The frequency of the claims is itself a testament to the show's reach, that nearly any comedy concept in American culture can plausibly be compared to something The Simpsons has done. Fact 298. The show has ended several seasons on cliffhangers of varying seriousness, from genuine narrative mysteries to elaborate jokes about the concept of the cliffhanger itself. The show's self-awareness about television convention has allowed it to both use and parody the cliffhanger form, and the most celebrated of its season-ending mysteries, Who Shot Mr. Burns, remains the standard against which all subsequent animated season finales are measured. Fact 299. The last frame of The Simpsons, whenever it eventually comes, has been a subject of occasional public speculation by the show's producers. Several have indicated that they have ideas about what the final moment should be, what image or what line should close 36 years of storytelling. Whether the show will end with a conventional series finale, with a final film, with a quiet conclusion to a normal episode, or with some other form that nobody has yet conceived, is unknown. The show has survived every prediction of its end so far by simply continuing, and there is no particular reason to believe that will change in the near future. Fact 300. The most remarkable thing about The Simpsons, the fact that sits underneath all the other facts and holds them up, is that it is still here. 36 years after a cartoonist invented a family in a hallway to protect a different project he cared about more, the family is still on television, still sitting on the same couch, still watching the same television. The children still the same ages they were the night the show debuted. Homer still working at the plant, Marge still holding it together with a patience that shouldn't be possible, Bart still throwing the same papers into the same trees on the same street on the same walk home from the same school. The loop continues. Springfield persists. The yellow faces and the four-fingered hands and the impossible hair and the nuclear plant on the hill and the tire fire at the edge of town and the three-eyed fish in the river, all of it still exactly where it was when we first arrived. You know the place by now. You know the people. You've spent time with them over years, maybe over decades, in the way you spend time with people who become part of the furniture of your life. Not because you chose them, but because they were simply always there when you turned on the television. And that, when you think about it, is its own kind of miracle. Not the Golden Age episodes, not the predictions, not the theories or the mysteries or the buried details that reward the most careful attention. The real miracle is simpler than any of that. A family that never changes, in a town that never ages, on a show that never ends, because we never stopped watching. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, thank you for spending this time in Springfield with me. Go ahead and close your eyes. The couch is empty and the television is on, and somewhere in that yellow house on Evergreen Terrace, Homer is just getting home. The door opens. The light is on in the kitchen. Marge is making something that smells like dinner. Everything is exactly as it should be. Number expansion. Deeper into Springfield. Additional detail and extended reflection. Throughout all 10 sections, the following passages expand each section of the main script with additional depth, extended analysis, and further storytelling. They are written to be inserted or appended as a continuous late-night companion piece, picking up the thread that the main script began. There's a version of this story where Matt Groening walks into that Fox executive's office and hands over Life in Hell without hesitation, and The Simpsons never exists. The world is a noticeably different place in that version. Not catastrophically different. The gaps in television culture would have been filled by something else eventually. But the specific shape that American comedy took in the 1990s and beyond, the willingness to be dark and intelligent and self-aware in animated form, that shape might have been quite different. It took an act of mild creative self-protection to set all of this in motion. Groening kept Life in Hell because he didn't trust what a network might do with it. In protecting one thing he cared about, he accidentally created something he would spend the rest of his professional life being defined by. The Tracy Ullman Show, the program that housed the original Simpsons shorts before the family got their own series, is itself an interesting artifact of late 1980s television culture. Ullman was a British comedian and actress whose variety show on the newly launched Fox network was an experiment in whether a different kind of television comedy could find an American audience. The show ran from 1987 to 1990 and produced 48 episodes, within which the Simpson family shorts appeared as small animations between live-action sketches. These shorts were rougher and stranger than what the eventual series became, the characters slightly more angular and alien, the comedy less warm and more jagged. They were experiments in what the family could be, and they were noticed immediately by the viewers who encountered them. The transition from short-form filler to standalone series required the show to answer a question that the shorts had deferred. What actually happens in this family? The shorts could content themselves with a brief premise and a punchline. A full series needed story, character development, and a world complex enough to sustain week after week of storytelling. Building that world occupied the first season in ways that are still visible if you watch the early episodes carefully. Characters who would later become richly defined are sketchy in Season 1, present but not yet fully themselves. The world of Springfield has its geography and its residents but not yet its history, its contradictions, its accumulated texture. The show was laying foundations in those early episodes, and the evidence of the construction is part of what makes rewatching them interesting. The Christmas special that launched the full series, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, established something crucial about the show's emotional register that distinguished it from every animated predecessor. The episode ends not with a punchline but with a quiet moment of domestic warmth. Homer, who has failed at almost every conventional measure of holiday success, who has secretly taken a humiliating part-time job as a mall Santa and then spent his small earnings on a losing dog at the racetrack, comes home with something unexpected and genuine. He has the dog. He has his family. He has made it through another year. The episode doesn't grade him on what he attempted. It grades him on what he gave. That distinction between effort measured by ambition and effort measured by love would run through the show's finest moments for the next 3.5 decades. The pilot episode that was actually produced for the network prior to the Christmas special, which has been discussed but never publicly aired, was reportedly rougher and less refined than what eventually made it to broadcast. The decision to lead with the Christmas special rather than the pilot was made partly because the Christmas episode felt more complete and more emotionally coherent, and partly because launching a new series in December, in the holiday viewing season, gave it a context and a warmth that a regular premiere wouldn't have provided. The timing was instinctive, and it was exactly right. And he gamble on the show reflected something specific about the network's situation in 1989. Fox was 3 years old and still trying to define itself against the three dominant networks. ABC, NBC, and CBS occupied the center of American television taste, the established, conventional, broadly appealing programming that most advertisers wanted to be attached to. Fox was competing from the margins, which meant it had both the freedom and the incentive to try things the major networks wouldn't. A cartoon about a working-class family with a father who was openly less intelligent than ideal, a son who was openly delinquent, and a plot that in its first episode revolved around gambling losses at a dog track was exactly the kind of thing Fox needed. It was television that felt like it wasn't supposed to be on television. That quality, the sense of something slightly illicit about it, attracted exactly the audience Fox was trying to build. The show's early critical reception was complicated. Some critics embraced it immediately as something genuinely new. Others were skeptical, treating animation as an inherently limited format and doubting whether a cartoon could sustain the kind of storytelling the show was attempting. The critical consensus that The Simpsons was one of the great achievements of American television took a few seasons to form, and by the time it was fully established, the show had already been running long enough that its eventual reputation as a cultural institution felt both earned and slightly surprising to the people who had made it. The merchandise explosion that followed the show's first season was so rapid and so comprehensive that it caught the show's own producers off guard. By 1991, Bart Simpson was one of the most recognized images in American consumer culture, appearing on t-shirts, hats, backpacks, lunchboxes, keychains, and an enormous range of other products. The sheer volume of Bart merchandise, produced in the show's first 2 years, exceeded anything that had been attempted for an animated character since Mickey Mouse in the 1930s. The cultural saturation was so complete that it generated a backlash, with people who associated the character with cheap licensed merchandise becoming resistant to the show itself, a resistance the show eventually overcame through the sheer quality of its material. The show's decision to make Springfield's location deliberately ambiguous was not, as has sometimes been suggested, an afterthought or a practical necessity. It was a founding philosophical choice, made before the show premiered, about the kind of story it wanted to tell. A specific, locatable Springfield would be someone's Springfield. An unlocatable Springfield could be anyone's. The show wanted to be about the American working class everywhere, not in any particular place, and geographic indeterminacy was the cleanest way to achieve that. It also had the advantage, which the show has exploited continuously, of generating exactly the kind of unanswerable fan speculation that keeps a show in conversation long after any specific episode has been forgotten. The original voice cast has been together for the entire run of the show, which is itself a remarkable fact about a production of this length and complexity. Voice cast stability is unusual in any long-running animated series, where the temptation to recast after contract disputes, the practical necessity of replacing actors who become unavailable, and the simple difficulty of maintaining professional relationships over decades all create pressure toward change. The Simpsons has maintained its core cast through negotiation, through genuine affection between the show and its performers, and through the recognition by all parties that the voices are so deeply embedded in the characters that replacing them would cost more than any contract dispute was worth. Homer's relationship with his own incompetence is one of the show's most carefully sustained comedic ideas. Most fictional incompetents are incompetent in ways they don't recognize, or incompetent in ways that are played entirely for laughs without any acknowledgement of cost. Homer is different. The show has, in its better episodes, been quite clear-eyed about what Homer's limitations cost him and the people around him. He doesn't always see it, but the show does, and it lets the audience feel the gap between what Homer perceives and what's actually happening. The episode in which Homer discovers that he could have been a great artist if circumstances had been different is one of the show's quietest sadnesses. Homer doesn't become a great artist. The circumstances weren't different. He is who he is, shaped by everything that has happened to him, and the glimpse of an alternative self serves only to illuminate the distance between what he became and what he might have been under other conditions. The show doesn't dwell on this. It moves on to the next joke, but the image stays, lodged somewhere in the episode's final impression, like a crayon in a brain. Homer's physical comedy has its own grammar, a specific set of rules about how his body behaves under stress that the show has developed and refined over 36 years. He falls in a particular way, arms pinwheeling, legs going in separate directions before the impact. He reacts to pain with a delay, the recognition coming a beat after the event, as if his nervous system processes the information slowly. He eats with a focus that excludes everything else in his environment, a total absorption that the show uses both as comedy and as a character note, because the same intensity he brings to food is the intensity he brings to everything he loves. When Homer is fully present with something, he is completely present with it. The problem is that what gets his full presence is often a donut. Homer's relationship with Ned Flanders, taken across the show's entire run, is more complicated than simple resentment. The show has given Homer and Ned genuine moments of connection, usually in situations of mutual crisis that strip away the social performances both of them maintain in ordinary life. When they are alone together, when there is nobody to perform for, something closer to actual friendship occasionally surfaces. It never lasts. The social roles reassert themselves. Homer goes back to resenting Ned's lawn, and Ned goes back to forgiving Homer with a cheerfulness that Homer finds more irritating than open hostility. But those brief moments of real connection suggest that, under different circumstances, these two men might have been genuinely important to each other. Homer's fame, such as it is within Springfield, has fluctuated enormously across the show's run. He has been celebrated, despised, celebrated again, forgotten, rediscovered, and returned to baseline more times than any character in the show's history. Springfield's relationship with Homer mirrors the audience's relationship with him in a way that's probably not intentional but is remarkably accurate. We know he's going to disappoint us. We love him anyway. We've been doing it for 36 years and we're not going to stop. Homer has had several moments across the show's run in which he displays a kind of emotional intelligence that his cognitive limitations should make impossible. He says the right thing to Marge in a moment of crisis with a precision and a depth that surprises both of them. He finds exactly the right words for Lisa when she needs to hear something true. He makes a gesture for Bart that cuts through years of accumulated frustration and says something simple and real. These moments are the show at its most honest about what Homer actually is, which is a man whose love for his family operates at a level his brain can't entirely access through ordinary channels, but that finds its way out in moments of genuine need. The question of what Homer would be without the family is one the show has occasionally gestured at through fantasy sequences and alternate universe episodes. The answer those episodes tend to give is that Homer without his family is a man whose considerable capacity for joy has nowhere to go, a person who enjoys things but doesn't love anything, who is content but not happy in the way that only connection to other people produces. Homer's family is not a burden on him. It is the thing that makes him a person, rather than simply an appetite with legs. The Simpson family's economic situation deserves more attention than it typically gets in discussions of the show. Homer's salary at the nuclear plant has been placed at various figures across different episodes, ranging from low enough to make the family's precarious finances clearly realistic to high enough that the precarity seems more like mismanagement than structural. The show has never been entirely consistent on this point, partly because the writers have not always agreed on what the Simpsons' economic class should feel like, and partly because different story needs require different economic realities. What the show has been consistent about is the emotional experience of economic precariousness, the fear of a big, unexpected bill, the calculation that happens when a car needs repairs and the money isn't there, the embarrassment of being unable to give your children things that other children have. Homer and Marge navigate these experiences in ways that feel recognizable to people who have lived inside that kind of financial anxiety, and the recognition is part of why the show has maintained its working-class audience through decades of cultural change that have left other shows behind. Marge's patience is sometimes discussed as if it were a simple personality trait, a baseline quality that defines her without complicating her. But the show has spent enough time with Marge's inner life to make clear that her patience is not passive. It is an active choice, made continuously, in the face of evidence that would justify choosing otherwise. Marge knows what Homer is. She knew it before she married him. In the episodes that explore their courtship, she chose him anyway, and she keeps choosing him, not out of obligation or lack of alternatives, but out of a genuine love that has survived more than enough tests to have proven itself real. The show has given Marge her own moments of genuine anger, genuine frustration, and genuine exhaustion with the life she has, and these moments are important because they demonstrate that her patience is not infinite, and her contentment is not guaranteed. She is not a saint. She is a person who has made choices and who lives with the consequences of those choices with more grace than most people could manage. The grace is real, but so is the cost. Lisa's loneliness is one of the show's most persistent emotional notes. She is surrounded by a family that loves her but cannot entirely understand her, that sees her intelligence and her passion and her moral seriousness, but experiences them primarily as inconveniences or as abstract sources of pride, rather than as the core of who their daughter and sister actually is. The family loves Lisa. They don't know quite what to do with her, and Lisa has spent 36 years learning to live with this gap between being loved and being known. The show has occasionally given Lisa friendships that seem to promise genuine understanding, and has then taken them away, usually not through cruelty but through circumstance. Teachers leave, friends move away. The new student who seemed to share Lisa's interests turns out to share only the surface of them. Each departure reinforces the lesson that Lisa is learning and resisting simultaneously, that her particular combination of gifts makes her genuinely difficult to know, and that the people capable of knowing her are rare. The show treats this not as a tragedy but as a condition, something Lisa lives with and occasionally overcomes and then learns all over again. Bart's relationship with his own intelligence is one of the show's more interesting unresolved threads. The show has established repeatedly that Bart is not actually stupid, that his academic failure is a choice rather than a limitation, and that his gifts, which run towards social intelligence, spatial reasoning, and creative problem-solving, are real but channeled into activities that the formal educational system doesn't recognize or reward. Bart understands people. He understands situations. He understands, with a precision that his grades don't reflect, exactly what any given moment requires and how to navigate it for maximum effect. These are genuine cognitive gifts. They just don't show up on standardized tests, and Springfield Elementary is not equipped to recognize what it's looking at. The relationship between Bart and Homer has its own specific quality that differs from Homer's relationships with his other children. With Lisa, Homer maintains a kind of proud bafflement, loving what he doesn't understand. With Maggie, there is pure tenderness, uncomplicated by any need to engage with who she is becoming because she is still so small. With Bart, the relationship is something more fraught and more equal, a dynamic between two people who are more similar than either would comfortably admit. Homer was Bart once. Not in every detail, but in the essential quality of a boy who was too much for the world around him and who managed that excess through a combination of charm and chaos. Homer sees himself in Bart and responds to that recognition sometimes with love and sometimes with a frustration that is really frustration with his own younger self. The family dog, Santa's little helper, has a richer emotional history in the show than he is usually credited with. His adoption in the very first episode establishes a template for how the Simpsons relate to strays and cast-offs, which is that they bring them home and make them family. Santa's little helper has been lost, injured, temporarily given away, and returned multiple times across the show's run, and each of these cycles reaffirms the family's basic commitment to the creatures in their care. He is not a significant character in any individual episode. Across the whole run of the show, he is a continuous presence that means something. The question of whether Mr. Burns has ever been genuinely happy is one that the show invites but doesn't answer. He has moments of satisfaction, particularly when a scheme succeeds or when he acquires something he wanted. He has moments of what might be pleasure, in the exercise of power, in the demonstration of his own superiority over others. But whether these add up to anything that resembles genuine happiness, in the way that Homer is genuinely happy eating a donut or that Lisa is genuinely happy playing her saxophone, the show leaves conspicuously open. The closest Burns comes to unambiguous happiness is in the Rosebud episode, in the moments when he holds the stuffed bear he has been searching for. Bobo is not a metaphor for power or for success. Bobo is a stuffed bear that a small boy loved, and the fact that the man Burns became still needs the thing the boy loved suggests that somewhere in the architecture of his personality, in some room that wealth and power and radiation and a century of ruthlessness haven't been able to reach, there is still something human. The show puts Bobo back in Burns's hands and then moves on without drawing conclusions. It does this intentionally. Conclusions about Burns would diminish him. Burns's management philosophy, as depicted across many episodes, is a masterpiece of deliberate dehumanization. He doesn't know his employees' names not because he's forgetful, but because knowing them would imply a relationship of mutual obligation that he refuses to enter into. He calls Homer by various wrong names throughout the show's run, each wrong name a small act of erasure. Homer is replaceable. Homer's function matters. Homer's identity does not. This is not carelessness, it is policy. The fact that Burns was once young enough to love a stuffed bear sits at the far end of a timeline that stretches back through multiple American historical periods, and that the show has never fully mapped. Who was young Burns? What did he want before the wanting calcified into hoarding? The show offers fragments. He attended Yale. He had a mother whose relationship with him was apparently no warmer than his relationships with everyone else. He served in a war he found morally ambiguous at best. He has spent the subsequent decades building something that protects him from the world's unpredictability with the thoroughness of a man who found that unpredictability genuinely frightening at some formative moment. The stuffed bear is the only evidence of what he was afraid of losing. Everything else he built to make sure he could never lose anything again. Burns's interactions with children, which are rare and consistently awkward, suggest that children represent something he genuinely doesn't know how to process. They are not yet part of the systems he understands. They haven't been sorted into their utility yet. They exist in a category that his framework for the world doesn't contain. When he encounters Bart or Lisa or Maggie, the show often uses the interaction to reveal something about Burns through the contrast, the child's directness cutting through the layers of performance and strategy that Burns deploys against adults. Ned Flanders' psychological history, once the show reveals it in the episode where he has a breakdown, casts everything we know about him in a different light. His childhood self, before the behavioral modification, is described as an out-of-control, wild, difficult child whose parents had no tools for managing him, and who turned in desperation to a psychiatrist who addressed the problem by essentially programming the aggression out of him. The programming worked. It worked too well. It produced a person whose goodness is so thorough and so consistent that it has no room for the natural variations that make goodness recognizable as a choice rather than a fixed state. What the show is saying about Ned's goodness is subtle and worth sitting with. It's not saying that Ned's goodness is fake. It's saying that goodness produced by programming rather than by choice is a different kind of thing from goodness that has struggled into existence through temptation and failure and the genuine difficulty of doing right when wrong. Would be easier. Ned can't do wrong. He was conditioned not to be able to, which means his right doing doesn't cost him the way it should, which means it doesn't accumulate the way genuine moral effort accumulates, which means he is, paradoxically, spiritually poorer for being behaviorally perfect. Chief Wiggum's corruption is worth examining because it is so thoroughly normalized within Springfield that it no longer registers as corruption in any meaningful way. Wiggum takes bribes, loses evidence, makes arrests based on personal convenience rather than legal cause, and generally maintains the peace through a combination of incompetence and flexible ethics that somehow produces a stable enough social order to function. The town has accommodated itself to this situation over many years, and the accommodation is so complete that pointing out Wiggum's corruption would feel, to most Springfield residents, like pointing out the weather. It is simply what is. Sideshow Bob's recurring defeats at the hands of Bart have accumulated enough that they have become a kind of mythology within the show. Bob is brilliant. Bob is capable of extraordinary planning and execution. Bob has resources, intelligence, and motivation that should make him more than capable of achieving his objectives. And yet every time he approaches the completion of his plan, something unmoors him. Usually it's his own ego, his inability to resist the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority at the moment when demonstration is most dangerous. But sometimes it's something stranger, a randomness in the universe that his brilliance can't account for, a rake on the ground at exactly the wrong moment, a coincidence so specific it begins to feel like something more than coincidence. Springfield doesn't simply fail Bob. Springfield seems constitutionally resistant to him in a way that raises questions about what kind of place this actually is. Moe's Tavern functions as a kind of confessional for Homer and the other regulars who drink there. It is a place where the performances required by ordinary social life can be dropped, where a man can be exactly as small and lost and confused as he actually is without anyone judging him for it, because everyone else in the bar is equally small and lost and confused. The tavern's darkness, its perpetual mid-afternoon light that makes every hour feel like the tail end of a long day, is the environmental condition that makes this particular kind of honesty possible. Moe himself is its reluctant priest, a man who hates what he's hearing and can't stop listening because what else is he going to do? The Quickie Mart's role in Springfield's daily life goes beyond convenience retail. It is the town's unofficial community center, the place where people encounter each other in the small transactions of daily life, and where the social fabric of the neighborhood is maintained through the accumulation of small interactions. Apu knows everyone who comes into his store. He knows their habits, their preferences, their families. He is more knowledgeable about the texture of Springfield's daily life than almost any other character in the show, and this knowledge is one of the things that makes his marginal status in the community so pointedly unjust. He knows Springfield better than Springfield knows him. The physical act of writing comedy at the speed The Simpsons requires has been described by former staff members as something that permanently changes the way you think. Once you have spent years in a room where the quality of an idea is tested in real time by the laughter or silence it produces in 20 other smart people, you develop a specific kind of analytical relationship with your own thoughts. You are always, in some part of your mind, testing what you're about to say before you say it. You are always aware, with a precision that other forms of creative work don't demand, of exactly how far a joke can be pushed before it stops being funny and becomes something else. This quality of mind, once developed, is not easily turned off. Former Simpsons writers have described social situations in which the muscle they built in the writer's room fires automatically, in which they find themselves internally timing the punchline of a real conversation or noting the structural weakness of someone else's anecdote. It is not always a comfortable mode to inhabit outside the specific environment it was built for. The show's relationship with its animation team is one of the most underexplored aspects of its production history. The animators who have worked on the show over its run have translated scripts into visual comedy in ways that the writers couldn't always have anticipated, finding in a character's movement or expression something that amplifies the written joke or occasionally replaces it with something better. The best animation in the show's history does things that writing alone cannot do: establishes rhythm, creates visual surprise, produces beauty in the middle of chaos, and the people responsible for those achievements deserve more credit than they typically receive in discussions of the show's creative legacy. The show's approach to music has always been more sophisticated than its format might suggest. The decision to use a live orchestra was made at the show's founding and has been maintained through considerable expense because the producers felt, and the show's history has validated, that the warmth and spontaneity of live performance produces something that no synthesized alternative can replicate. Music in comedy does specific work. It signals mood, establishes pacing, cushions emotional transitions, and creates the psychological space in which a particular kind of attention becomes possible. The Simpsons' music has always done this work well, and the care that has gone into its production is visible or audible in every episode. The question of the show's relationship with its own quality decline is one that has occupied its critics and its defenders in roughly equal measure since the mid-90s. The critics argue that the show peaked during its golden age and has been running on fumes and institutional momentum since then. The defenders argue that even a diminished Simpsons is better than most of what surrounds it, that the show's worst episodes contain more intelligence and craft than the average output of most comedies, and that demanding that a show sustain its own peak across 3.5 decades is an expectation applied to no other human creative endeavor. Both positions contain truth. The decline is real. The residual quality is also real. What the show is now is not what it was. And what it was extraordinary, and both of these things are true simultaneously. The Simpsons' predictive reputation has created an interesting secondary phenomenon, which is the retroactive search for predictions in episodes that were not originally considered predictive at all. As the show's prediction mythology has grown, viewers have gone back through the archive looking for additional evidence, finding alignments between old episodes and recent events that the original audience never noticed. Some of these retroactive discoveries are genuine coincidences. Some are the product of sufficiently loose interpretation that almost anything could be made to align with anything, and a small number are specific enough that even skeptics find them difficult to dismiss entirely. The cultural mechanism through which the predictions gain their power is worth understanding clearly. When a Simpsons episode is shared on social media as a prediction, it travels through networks of people who have a prior relationship with the show, who already associate it with intelligence and prescience, and who are primed by that association to read the alignment between the old episode and the current event as significant. The framing does real work. An identical alignment between a different show and the same event might generate much less attention, simply because the other show doesn't carry the same reputation for cultural foresight. The Simpsons' predictions are partly a product of the show itself and partly a product of the show's reputation, which has become so substantial that it amplifies the significance of anything the show appears to have gotten right. The show's ability to serve as a kind of cultural shorthand for people talking about real events is itself one of the most remarkable aspects of its cultural position. When something happens in American public life that is simultaneously absurd, systemic, and difficult to address directly, people reach for Simpsons references because the show has already processed so many similar situations and provided a framework for thinking about them. The references serve as a way of saying, "This is not new, we have seen this before, the show already told us this was coming." Whether or not the show actually predicted the specific event is less important than the sense of recognition the reference provides. The comfort of knowing that at least one cultural artifact had been paying close enough attention to see this coming. The golden age of The Simpsons produced a specific kind of comedy that has proven extraordinarily difficult to replicate, not because the jokes were unusually clever or the satire unusually sharp, but because the show had found a precise balance between warmth and darkness, between the comfort of familiar characters and the discomfort of honest observation that held together only through a combination of talent, timing, and institutional conditions that don't often coincide. The writers were excellent and working at the peak of their creative lives. The characters were established enough to carry weight but new enough to still surprise. The culture the show was satirizing was specific and recognizable enough for the jokes to land, but not so specific that they excluded anyone who wasn't already deep inside the reference. All of these conditions were in place at the same time, and the result was television that justified every piece of critical praise it received. The transition out of the golden age was gradual and is still debated in terms of its exact timing. Most analysts place the beginning of the decline somewhere between the 8th and 10th seasons, noting a shift in the show's comedic approach from character-based humor grounded in The Simpsons' domestic reality to more frenetic, plot-driven episodes in which the family's normal lives were regularly suspended in favor of more elaborate adventures. The shift was not absolute and not permanent, and the show has produced individual episodes of genuine quality in every season. But the center of gravity moved, and the show that exists now is measurably different from the show that won the argument for animated comedy in the early 90s. What the Golden Age episodes did at their best was make you feel two things simultaneously. They made you laugh and they made you care, and the caring was not separate from the laughing but was produced by the same mechanism. The comedy and the emotion were not alternating registers. They were the same thing expressed through different frequencies. An episode like Mother Simpson is funny throughout and devastating at the end. And the devastation works precisely because the comedy has been doing real character work all along, building the relationship between Homer and his mother with enough specificity that the farewell scene lands with the weight of something genuinely lost, rather than something generically sad. The best writers in the Golden Age understood instinctively that sentimentality was the enemy of genuine emotion, that a scene played too directly for feeling would produce resistance in an audience that had come to the show for comedy. The trick was to earn the emotion through indirection, to build toward it through jokes that were also character observations, through situations that were simultaneously absurd and recognizable, and then to let the emotional moment arrive not as a departure from the comedy, but as its culmination. When the show got this right, it produced something that hasn't been replicated in animated television since. The show's willingness to be uncomfortable has made it a productive target for controversy across its entire run, and the history of those controversies tells you something interesting about American cultural politics over the decades. The things that generated the most intense objections in the 1990s were different from the things that generated them in the 2000s, which were different again from the controversies of the 2010s. The show's sensibility has remained relatively consistent, while the culture around it has shifted, which means that different aspects of the show have come into conflict with different aspects of the prevailing cultural consensus at different moments. This makes the show's controversy history a kind of cultural calendar, a record of what American audiences found acceptable and what they found transgressive at different points in recent history. The guest star tradition has evolved in ways that reflect the show's changing relationship with its own cultural position. In the early seasons, the show was a new phenomenon that celebrities wanted to be associated with because it was genuinely exciting, genuinely new, and genuinely popular in a way that conferred cultural credibility. By the 2000s, appearing on The Simpsons had become a rite of passage, something that significant figures in American entertainment were expected to do rather than something they sought out. And in the later seasons, the relationship between the show and its guest stars has sometimes felt more promotional than creative, the celebrity's presence serving the needs of the marketing department more than the needs of the story being told. The show's most memorable guest performances share a quality of commitment that transcends the simple fact of the celebrity's presence. What makes Albert Brooks's Hank Scorpio unforgettable is not that Albert Brooks is in the episode. It's that Albert Brooks understood exactly what the character required and gave it everything he had. What makes Dustin Hoffman's Mr. Bergstrom memorable is not the pseudonym or the promotional value of the casting, but the genuineness of the performance, the specific quality of attention Hoffman brought to a role that might easily have been a throwaway. When celebrities show up and do the work, the episodes they appear in become something more than the sum of their parts. When they show up and trade on their names, the episodes are usually forgettable, regardless of who's in them. The deepest layer of The Simpsons' hidden world is not the Easter eggs or the background details or the callbacks to previous episodes. It is the accumulated weight of everything the show has said across 36 years about what it means to live in a particular time and place with a particular set of limitations and a particular set of loves. The show is, at its foundation, a sustained meditation on ordinary life, on the way ordinary life contains more humor and more sadness and more beauty than ordinary life is typically given credit for. The Easter eggs are the show acknowledging that some of its audience is paying extremely close attention and choosing to reward that attention with small gifts that don't change the meaning of what they're watching, but do deepen the pleasure of watching it. They are the show's way of saying, "We know you're here, we see you, here is something that belongs to you specifically." The mainstream audience gets the show. The devoted audience gets the show and the Easter eggs. And the people who have watched every episode multiple times and know the production history and can identify the writers by their stylistic signatures get something that operates more like a relationship than entertainment. The show's treatment of its own longevity in its later seasons has been one of its most interesting creative challenges. How do you write a show about the same characters doing essentially the same things in the same town for 36 years without running out of ideas or losing the ability to say anything true? The answer the show has found, imperfectly but recognizably, is to go smaller rather than larger, to find new angles on familiar dynamics rather than inventing new dynamics, and to accept that the show's depth comes from duration rather than novelty, from the accumulated weight of everything it has established rather than from anything it's still discovering. The final fact about The Simpsons, the one that everything else comes back to, is that the show is loved, not in the passive way that something familiar and comfortable is tolerated or appreciated, in the active way that something has been genuinely important to the lives of the people who have watched it. For many of those people, The Simpsons is inseparable from specific periods of their lives, from Saturday mornings or Sunday evenings or childhood bedrooms or college apartments or the routines of adult life that organize themselves around the show's broadcast schedule. The show lives in those memories alongside the real memories, and over enough years it becomes genuinely difficult to separate the feeling of a particular time in your life from the feeling of the episodes you were watching during it. That's what 36 years of consistent presence produces. Not just nostalgia, not just familiarity, something more specific than either. A show that has been present for long enough that it has become part of the experience of being alive in a particular country during a particular stretch of history. The Simpsons will eventually end. All things end. But the Springfield that exists in the memories of the people who grew up with it will persist for as long as those people do. A yellow-faced, four-fingered, permanently 11 o'clock on a Sunday evening version of a world that was always slightly more than what it appeared to be. Whatever time it is where you are, however dark the room is, however close you are to sleep, Springfield is still out there, exactly as you left it. The plant is lit up against the night sky. Burns is somewhere in his mansion doing something that benefits no one but himself. Ned is praying with a sincerity that will not be rewarded but will not be abandoned. And Homer is on the couch, remote in hand, not quite asleep and not quite awake, in the particular suspended state between the two that is the closest he ever comes to peace. There's a version of Springfield that you never quite see directly, the version that exists between episodes, in the spaces where the story isn't happening, the grocery stores that aren't the Quickie Mart, the streets that don't get named, the citizens who appear in crowd scenes but whose lives the show has never followed home. Springfield is a town of approximately 30,000 people, which is the population estimate most consistent with the school sizes, the crowd sizes at public events, and the economic scale of the institutions the show depicts. 30,000 people living together in a town with no fixed location, inside a geography that can't exist, breathing air that probably isn't great, drinking water that definitely isn't great, going about their lives with the cheerful obliviousness that the show has always identified as Springfield's defining psychological feature. Springfield Elementary School is one of the show's most thoroughly developed settings outside of the Simpson house itself. It has a specific layout, a specific culture, a specific cast of staff members whose relationships with each other and with the student body have been developed across hundreds of episodes. Principal Skinner's office is a space charged with power and defeat simultaneously, because Skinner is a man who has the title of authority without the capacity to exercise it effectively. His attempts to discipline students or manage his staff, always undermined by his own psychological limitations and by the structural contempt in which his mother and his superintendent hold him. The school's hallways are where Bart's social world operates. The classroom is where Lisa's frustrations accumulate. The gym is where both of them are regularly reminded that the institutions designed to prepare children for life are not particularly well equipped to accommodate children who don't fit neatly into the expected categories. Springfield General Hospital appears in enough episodes that it has developed its own institutional personality. It is a place where competence and catastrophe coexist in proportions that seem unlikely until you've spent enough time in any real hospital to recognize the accuracy. Dr. Hibbert, the show's principal physician, is distinguished from Dr. Nick primarily by his willingness to be somewhat more honest about what he's observing, though both characters operate within a system that the show depicts as fundamentally shaped by economic incentives rather than by medical ones. The show's treatment of healthcare, in episodes that address the cost of medical care and the consequences of inadequate insurance, is among its most pointed social commentary and it has aged into something that looks more like documentation than satire. Lionel Hutz's practice, before Phil Hartman's death retired the character, established Springfield's legal culture as operating on principles that would be immediately recognizable to anyone who has dealt with American civil litigation and its capacity to produce outcomes disconnected from justice. Hutz was catastrophically bad at his profession in ways that were both funnier and more accurate than a competent lawyer character could have been. His incompetence was not random but systematic, the product of specific bad habits and specific cognitive limitations that produced specific categories of failure in specific situations. He was a portrait of a type, the perpetually optimistic small-time operator who has absorbed the language of his profession without acquiring its substance, and the portrait was so well observed that it generated the kind of recognition laughter that comes from seeing something true rendered visible. Springfield's economy is more diverse than the nuclear power plant's dominance might suggest, though Burns's plant is clearly the engine around which everything else is organized. The town has a bowling alley, a movie theater, a baseball stadium, several restaurants, a harbor with some kind of maritime commerce, a retirement home, multiple religious institutions, a newspaper, a television station, and enough small businesses that the downtown area gives the impression of a functioning commercial district. The economy of Springfield is not prosperous. The businesses that exist there operate at the margins of viability, sustained by the captive market of a population that doesn't have many alternatives and that has learned to accept limited options as the natural condition of things. Moe's Tavern should probably not be a going concern, given the size of its regular customer base and the quality of its facilities. It persists because Springfield's residents need it to persist, because the alternatives to Moe's are either worse or non-existent. The town's political structures, centered on Mayor Quimby's administration and Chief Wiggum's police department, are so thoroughly compromised that the question of what they would look like if they were functioning correctly has no obvious answer. Quimby has been mayor for so long, and the mechanisms of his continued incumbency are so embedded in the town's institutions, that imagining a Springfield without him requires imagining a Springfield that is fundamentally different at its structural level. The corruption is not an add-on to a system that would otherwise function. It is load-bearing. Remove it and you'd need to rebuild from the ground up. The Halloween specials deserve their own extended consideration because they represent a version of Springfield that operates by different rules and has different creative ambitions from the regular show. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which began in the second season and have continued every year since, take the characters and the setting of the regular show and place them inside horror film premises, science fiction scenarios, and literary adaptations that the realistic format of the regular show couldn't accommodate. What's distinctive about the Treehouse of Horror episodes, at their best, is that they're not simply horror parodies. They use the horror format to explore aspects of the characters that the regular show keeps contained. Homer in a Treehouse of Horror episode can be genuinely monstrous, not in the comic way he sometimes is in regular episodes, but in a way that takes the darkness underlying his character and gives it direct expression. Burns in a horror special can be something even worse than what he is normally, stripped of the social conventions that make his regular behavior legible as human, even at its worst. The horror format gives the show permission to be more extreme in its emotional and thematic content than the family sitcom frame allows, and the show has used that permission creatively across 3.5 decades. The shining parody in Treehouse of Horror 5, titled The Shinning, is frequently cited as one of the finest parodies of a specific film in the history of American comedy. It works not simply because it reproduces the Kubrick film's visual vocabulary and narrative structure in a compressed form, but because it finds genuine comic logic in the premise. Homer's descent into violence is motivated in the Simpsons version, not by supernatural possession, but by the absence of television and beer, which is both a joke about Homer's character and a point about the Kubrick film's interest in the things that civilize men and what happens when those things are removed. The parody has an argument, and the argument is funny because it's true. Treehouse of Horror episodes have also been among the show's most formally experimental, using animation to do things that couldn't be done any other way, creating visual horror that is genuinely unsettling even within a comedic context, and playing with genre conventions in ways that demonstrate real knowledge of and affection for the horror tradition they're drawing on. The best Treehouse episodes feel like they were made by people who loved horror films and understood why they worked, not simply by people who found horror a convenient source of parody material. The tradition of the wraparound segments, in which the Halloween stories are introduced within a narrative frame that itself becomes part of the comedy, has been used with varying degrees of success. Some wraparound segments are as funny as the stories they contain. Others are primarily functional, serving to transition between segments without adding much. The most successful Treehouse episodes tend to be ones where the three segments have some kind of thematic coherence that makes the whole feel more unified than a simple anthology. Even if the show doesn't press this coherence explicitly, the floating timeline, which keeps the show's characters permanently young while the world around them moves forward, produces an interesting relationship with memory that the show has explored in various ways. If the characters don't age, they also don't accumulate. They don't build toward anything. Each episode is complete in itself, and the next episode begins from approximately the same starting position, regardless of what the previous one did to the characters or the town. This has been described as a limitation. It is also a freedom that the show has used well, the freedom to begin again, to reset, to approach the same fundamental dynamics from a new angle without being constrained by the logic of what came before. Human memory doesn't work the way the show's timeline works, but it rhymes with it in interesting ways. We remember some things and forget others. And the things we remember aren't necessarily the most important things that happened, but the things that were most vivid, most emotionally charged, most connected to other memories that give them context. The Simpsons occupies this kind of memorial space for many of its long-term viewers. They don't remember every episode in sequence. They remember specific moments, specific images, specific lines, and these memories are stored alongside the real memories of their own lives in a way that makes the show's fictional events feel, in some ways, as real as the actual events they lived through. This quality, the integration of the show's moments into personal memory alongside real events, is what the most devoted fans are describing when they talk about the show being part of their lives. They don't mean that they prioritize it over real experience. They mean that it has accumulated in the same place that real experience accumulates, in the part of themselves where important things are stored. This is a remarkable achievement for any work of art. For a cartoon about a yellow family in an impossible town, it is something that takes the breath away slightly, if you think about it long enough at the end of a quiet night. The show's relationship with its own past has become more complicated as the run has lengthened. In the early seasons, the show's history was shallow enough that callbacks and references worked simply. Now the show has accumulated enough history that a reference to a third-season episode is a reference that most current viewers won't catch, because most current viewers weren't watching in the third season and may not have sought out those early episodes since. The show's archive has become simultaneously its greatest resource and its greatest challenge, a depth of material so extensive that it creates as many problems of navigation as it solves. The show has addressed this partly by treating each episode as self-contained, requiring no prior knowledge to understand, and partly by embracing the knowledge that different viewers bring different depths of familiarity. A first-time viewer and a 30-year veteran of the show can watch the same episode and have different experiences, and both experiences can be valid. The first-time viewer gets the surface. The veteran gets the surface and everything underneath it. This layering is one of the most sophisticated structural features of a show that is not, on its surface, obviously sophisticated. Springfield is a particular kind of fictional place, not the idealized small town of Norman Rockwell, where everyone knows their neighbor and the problems are small and the resolutions are warm. Not the dystopian small town of American Gothic, where the surface pleasantness conceals something genuinely sinister. Springfield is something more specific and more honest than either of those. A town where the surface and the depths are simultaneously visible to anyone who chooses to look, and where most of the inhabitants have simply chosen not to look. Not because they're bad people, because looking is uncomfortable and the town's systems, economic, social, chemical, are arranged to make not looking the path of least resistance. This specific quality, the transparency of the corruption, combined with the population's continued willingness to not see it clearly, is what makes Springfield so recognizable to viewers across such diverse geographic and cultural contexts. The specific details are American. The underlying dynamic is universal. Every community has its version of the three-eyed fish, the thing that is obviously wrong that everyone has agreed to normalize, because acknowledging it would require changing something else that the community depends on. Every community has its burns, the concentration of power whose continued existence is so embedded in the local economy that challenging it feels more dangerous than accommodating it. Every community has its Homer, the person who understands on some level that something is wrong but who has calculated, consciously or not, that the cost of seeing it clearly is higher than the cost of the fog. The show has been making this argument for 36 years, making it through comedy rather than through polemic, trusting that if you can make people laugh at something true, you can make them understand it in ways that direct argument cannot achieve. Whether the argument has had any effect on the world outside Springfield is impossible to measure. Whether it has made any viewer look at their own town's three-eyed fish with more clarity than they would have looked at it without the show's 36 years of preparation is equally unmeasurable. Art doesn't work on that kind of direct causal chain. It works through accumulation, through the slow adjustment of what feels normal and what feels wrong, through the gradual expansion of the frame through which we see. The Simpsons has been part of that accumulation for a very long time. It has made certain things visible that might otherwise have remained invisible. It has made certain arguments in the language of comedy that couldn't have been made as effectively in any other language. It has given 36 years of audiences a shared set of references for talking about the gap between what American life promises and what American life delivers. And that shared vocabulary is itself a kind of gift, a way of saying to strangers, yes, I see it too. I know what you mean, the show already gave us words for this. That's not a small thing. In a culture that moves fast and forgets faster, a show that has been making the same observations for 36 years, and that has embedded those observations in the memories of multiple generations, is doing something genuinely valuable, not just entertaining. Something beyond entertaining. Something that sits in the accumulated furniture of a culture and holds its shape long after the individual episodes that furnished it have been partially forgotten. Close your eyes. Let the voices settle. Homer's somewhere laughing at something he doesn't fully understand. Marge is sighing with patience that is both genuine and not inexhaustible. Bart is outside doing something inadvisable. Lisa is reading in her room, probably something that will make her sad in a way she'll find useful. Maggie is watching everything, remembering everything, waiting. Springfield is at it again. It always is. The Simpsons has a complicated relationship with its own continuity that is worth understanding on its own terms, rather than simply as a failure of consistency. Most long-running serialized dramas treat continuity as sacred, building their worlds on the assumption that what happened in an earlier episode remains permanently true in all subsequent ones. The Simpsons has never operated this way, and it has always known it wasn't operating this way, which is what separates its approach from simple carelessness. The decision to treat each episode as essentially self-contained, with continuity maintained at the level of character and relationship, but not at the level of specific event, was a philosophical choice about what kind of story the show wanted to tell. It wanted to tell a story about who these people are, not about what these people have done. Their essential natures, Homer's love and his limitations, Marge's patience and her suppressed desire for more, Bart's mischief and his buried tenderness, Lisa's intelligence and her loneliness, these remain consistent across every episode, regardless of what specific events have occurred. The events are illustrations of the nature. They are not the nature itself. This approach has real costs. Characters who have had profound experiences in one episode return in the next episode having apparently forgotten them entirely. Relationships that seem to reach a new level of understanding reset to their default state. Homer learns something important about himself in one episode and demonstrates no awareness of that lesson in the next. For viewers who value serialized development, who want to watch characters grow and change over time, this is a genuine frustration. The show isn't giving them what they're asking for, but the show is giving them something else, something that serialized drama can't easily provide, which is the experience of knowing characters deeply without the exhaustion of tracking their complete histories. You can watch any episode of The Simpsons at any point in its run and understand who these people are. You don't need to have seen the previous 100 episodes to know that Homer loves his family, that Marge worries, that Bart performs indifference as a social strategy, that Lisa cares too much about everything. The characters carry their essential natures on their surface, and no amount of forgetting or resetting can strip those natures away. The continuity that matters is preserved. The continuity that doesn't matter is allowed to dissolve. This is actually a sophisticated position, more sophisticated than it looks. It treats character as something distinct from event, personality as something distinct from biography, and it asks the audience to value what these people are over what these people have done. Most stories don't make this distinction explicitly. The Simpsons has built its entire structural philosophy around it. Homer's relationship with God is one of the show's most unusual ongoing threads. In a show that has always been skeptical of institutional religion, Homer's personal relationship with the divine is depicted as genuine and uncomplicated. He talks to God. God occasionally talks back. The conversations are casual in a way that would seem irreverent if the show were not simultaneously taking them seriously. Homer the Heretic, the episode in which Homer decides to stop going to church and spends the day alone in joyful communion with what he experiences as divine presence, is one of the show's most theologically interesting episodes. Homer's experience of the sacred isn't formal or doctrinal. It's sensory and immediate. He is happy. He feels loved. He experiences the Sunday at home as holier than any Sunday in church, and the show doesn't entirely disagree with him. The episode ends with the church burning down and the community coming together to rebuild it, which suggests that organized religion has a communal function worth preserving, even if its formal practice isn't where Homer finds God. But it also never contradicts Homer's experience of the day as genuinely spiritual. God's voice in the show, in the episodes where God speaks, is heard but the face is not shown below the eyeline. A visual convention that keeps the divine slightly mysterious even within the show's very literal metaphysical framework. The show has positioned God as real, present, occasionally amused, and fundamentally concerned with Homer's well-being in a way that doesn't fully track with what the most devout characters in Springfield are practicing. Ned Flanders prays constantly and receives silence. Homer prays occasionally and gets answers. The show doesn't explain the discrepancy. It simply depicts it and moves on, leaving the theological implications for the audience to process. The coma theory intersects with Homer's relationship with God in a way that several fans have developed at length. If Homer is dreaming since April of 1993, then God's appearance in Homer the Heretic, which aired 6 months before the coma episode, functions as a farewell conversation. God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. 6 months later, Homer enters the coma. The show has never confirmed this reading, and the producers have denied that any such intention was behind the God scene. But the timeline is precise enough, and the correspondence close enough, that the coincidence has become part of the theory's most compelling evidence. The flash-forward episodes, in which the show imagines its characters in a future that the floating timeline will never officially arrive at, are among the most emotionally resonant in the show's history. They work because they reveal not what the characters will become, but what the show imagines they could become. And the gap between the imagined future and the permanent present of the show is where the feeling lies. Lisa's Wedding, the episode that depicts Lisa as a young woman engaged to a British man named Hugh, is the most developed of these futures. Lisa is recognizable as an adult version of the character we know, brilliant and principled and slightly lost in her own earnestness, finding a partner who appreciates her intellect but who doesn't quite understand the family she comes from. The episode is a meditation on what it means to grow up and discover that the people you love are embarrassing to the people you're trying to impress, and on the moment when you have to decide whether to be embarrassed by your family or to love them more defiantly than you love your pride. The choice Lisa makes in the episode to embrace her family rather than distance herself from them is not presented as an obvious one. The future Hugh, who visits Springfield for the engagement party, is condescending about everything he encounters. Homer's antics are mortifying in exactly the way they would be to someone encountering them for the first time, without the accumulated affection of a lifetime. Lisa's defense of her family is not easy or automatic. It is a genuine choice made against real social pressure, and the episode honors that difficulty by not making it comfortable. What the episode also does, and what makes it genuinely touching rather than simply sentimental, is place Homer's love for Lisa at its center. Homer's attempts to learn proper etiquette for the engagement party, his earnest and repeatedly failing efforts to be the father Lisa deserves to have in this moment, are comic in the way Homer's sincere efforts are always comic through the gap between the aspiration and the result. But the aspiration is real. Homer wants to be good enough for his daughter's significant moment. He fails. And his failure is the most loving thing in the episode, because it is the failure of a man who is trying with everything he has, which is exactly what love looks like when the person doing it is Homer Simpson. The show has always given Marge less interior depth than she deserves, which is partly by design and partly a limitation that the show has acknowledged in its better moments. Marge's patience, her containment, her willingness to absorb the difficulties of her life without demanding that they be resolved or compensated, are qualities the show has sometimes treated as simply who she is, rather than as choices she makes continuously against real internal pressure. The episodes that pull back Marge's surface and show what's underneath are among the show's most valuable, because they demonstrate that the woman, maintaining the family's equilibrium, is doing so at real personal cost and with real personal desires that the maintenance of equilibrium constantly defers. Marge wanted to be an artist. She has a genuine creative gift that she expressed briefly in one episode and then folded back into the practical requirements of her domestic life. Marge wanted a career, several careers at several points in the show's run, and each attempt has been complicated by Homer's needs, the children's needs, the family's economic realities, and the town's limited sense of what a woman in Marge's position is supposed to want. The show has been somewhat brave in depicting Marge's dissatisfaction when it has depicted it at all. It doesn't resolve her dissatisfaction into contentment by the episode's end in any way that feels dishonest. It acknowledges that she has given up things, that some of those things would have made her happier than she is, and that her choice to stay and to sustain the family is a real choice, with real costs that love alone doesn't fully compensate for. This is a more honest portrait of long-term partnership than most television manages, and it sits inside a show that is primarily comedic in a way that requires the viewer to bring their own attentiveness to find it. Marge's relationship with her own anger is one of the show's most interesting subtexts. She experiences anger. The show has depicted it, but her habitual management of anger, her tendency to address problems obliquely, to hint at her distress rather than express it directly, to maintain the surface of pleasantness even when the interior is in turmoil, is a character trait with a recognizable psychological origin. Marge grew up in a household that prized surface pleasantness over emotional honesty. She learned early that expressing negative emotions directly was uncomfortable for the people around her and costly to herself. The blue hair going up instead of down is her version of going inward instead of out. The show has, in its finest moments, given Marge the opportunity to express her anger directly, and those moments tend to be among the most dramatically satisfying in any episode they appear in. Marge's anger is not explosive or dramatic. It is specific and precise, and it names things clearly, which makes it more frightening than any amount of volume would. The family always pays attention when Marge is genuinely angry. They know what it means that she's given up managing the surface. There is a version of the question, why do we keep watching The Simpsons, that has an easy answer. Habit, comfort. The familiar voices and the familiar setting and the familiar rhythms of a show we've known long enough that it requires nothing from us. We watch it the way we return to any comfortable place, not because we expect to discover something new, but because familiarity itself is a form of pleasure, a relief from the endless newness of everything else. But that answer, while true as far as it goes, doesn't account for the quality of the attachment that the show's longest devotees describe. This isn't just comfortable television. This is television that people feel something for, that sits in their emotional lives at a depth that comfortable habit doesn't explain. There is real feeling in the relationship that long-term viewers have with this show, a kind of love that is not merely nostalgic even when it wears nostalgia's clothes. The real reason we stay, the deeper answer beneath the comfortable one, is that The Simpsons has always told the truth about the things it cares about, even while being funny about them, even while keeping them at the distance that comedy provides, even while using the yellow faces and the four fingers and the impossibly blue hair to signal that this is not quite the real world and doesn't have to play by the real world's rules. The truth it has told, consistently, for 36 years, is that ordinary life is full of meaning, that the people who love each other imperfectly are still loving each other, that the father who can't quite say what he feels still feels it, that the child who rebels is still reaching towards something, that the mother who never quite gets what she wants hasn't stopped wanting it, and that the wanting itself is a form of dignity. These are not complicated truths. They are, in fact, quite simple ones. The Simpsons has been making them for 36 years in the language of comedy, which is perhaps the most powerful language available for making truths that everyone knows but that direct statement somehow fails to land. You can't tell people that ordinary life is meaningful. They'll nod and immediately forget. You can make them laugh at a cartoon father eating a donut and, in the space that the laughter opens, slip in the fact that the donut is the closest thing Homer has to a religious experience, and that this is both funny and entirely true, and that the entire family watching him eat it is the fact of his life that sustains him. We stay because the show keeps doing this, imperfectly now, less consistently than it once did, with a golden age that glitters behind it and a present that often aspires to, rather than achieves what that past contained, but still doing it. Still finding, in the space between jokes, something that is not just entertainment. Still, after all this time, trying to tell us something true about what it is to be a person in the world, inside a family, in a town that doesn't appear on any map, beneath a sky that sometimes glows in colors that no healthy sky should glow. Still here, still on, still yellow and four-fingered and improbably alive. The lights are on, the plant is humming, and somewhere on Evergreen Terrace, the TV is still going. It always is. The Simpsons arrived on American television at a specific cultural moment, the end of the 1980s, when the particular economic anxieties of the American working class had been building for a decade and had not yet found a satisfying representational home on primetime television. The shows that dominated primetime in the years before The Simpsons premiered tended either toward upper-middle-class comfort, the kind of aspirational lifestyle television that presented professional success as the natural and achievable destination for any American family, or toward a fantasy of working-class contentment that smoothed over the actual stresses of economic precarity with warmth and resolution. The Simpsons did something different. It took the economic anxiety seriously, depicted it accurately, and then processed it through comedy in a way that made it bearable without making it disappear. Homer's salary anxiety, his awareness that he is one unexpected expense away from genuine crisis, his complicated feelings about the gap between what he has and what he imagines having, these are not background details in the show's portrait of the family. They are structural. The Simpson family's economic situation shapes every major decision they make, every crisis they face, every aspiration they pursue. The show has never resolved this anxiety by making the family prosperous. Homer keeps working at the plant. The bills keep coming. The family keeps managing, which is exactly the experience of a specific stratum of American economic life that was not being depicted on primetime television with this kind of honesty anywhere else. The comparison with the Flanders family is useful here, because Ned's relative prosperity, his nicer house, his better-maintained yard, his ability to absorb financial setbacks that would devastate the Simpsons, is one of the genuine sources of Homer's resentment. Homer's dislike of Ned is not entirely irrational. Ned has more. Ned's more is visible every day from Homer's front window, and the show is honest enough to let this be part of what Homer feels, rather than insisting that Homer's resentment is purely a reflection of his own moral limitations. The resentment has a material basis, and the show acknowledges that material basis even as it also acknowledges that the resentment has grown beyond what the material basis can justify. The Simpsons has been self-aware about its own nature from very early in its run, and the self-awareness has deepened as the show has continued. In the early seasons, the show's self-reference was relatively light, a wink at the audience here and there, a joke about the nature of the medium. By the middle seasons, the show had developed a full vocabulary of self-aware comedy, jokes about its own conventions, its own longevity, its own place in the culture. In the later seasons, the self-awareness has sometimes become the primary mode, the show talking about itself more than it's talking about anything else. The self-awareness is both the show's strength and one of its potential weaknesses. As a strength, it prevents the show from ever becoming entirely naive about what it is and what it's doing. The show knows it's a television program with conventions and constraints and a commercial context, and it acknowledges this in ways that prevent the audience from ever being entirely taken in. As a potential weakness, self-awareness can become a substitute for genuine creative risk, a way of commenting on the show's limitations rather than transcending them. The funniest joke about a thing is not always better than the thing itself. The show's most effective self-awareness is deployed in service of something beyond the self-reference. When Homer watches television in a way that reflects the audience's own watching, the joke is not merely about the act of watching. It's about what we watch for, what we get from it, what we're substituting it for. When the show makes jokes about its own declining quality, the best of those jokes are not just defensive. They're honest examinations of what happens to creative work over time, and why the things that made it good are difficult to sustain. The self-awareness earns its place when it's doing real work, when it's adding to the show's portrait of itself and its world rather than simply acknowledging that the show exists. There's something specific about Springfield at night that the show has occasionally captured in ways that make it feel genuinely different from the daytime Springfield. The establishing shots at night, the plant lit up on the hill, the darkness of the residential streets, the specific quality of yellow light coming from the Simpson house's windows. These create an atmosphere that the daytime comedy doesn't require, but that the show reaches for in its more atmospheric moments. Homer driving home late from Moe's, the streets quiet, the houses dark, the town temporarily at rest from its particular brand of chaos. Marge sitting alone in the kitchen after everyone has gone to sleep, thinking about something the show doesn't name. Lisa reading by lamplight, while the rest of the house breathes in sleep. These are the moments when Springfield feels like a real place, rather than a cartoon setting. When the show's world develops the specific texture of places that exist in 3 dimensions, rather than 2. The nighttime Springfield is the show's way of acknowledging that there is life happening between the episodes, in the spaces where the story isn't, and that this life has its own quality and its own feeling. The family doesn't only exist when the plot requires them. They have quiet moments, unnarrated moments, moments when nothing is happening except the ordinary passage of time. The show gives us glimpses of these moments in its establishing shots and its transitional sequences, and the glimpses are enough to make Springfield feel inhabited rather than simply set-dressed. In the end, whatever else The Simpsons is, it is a 36-year portrait of a specific version of American life, painted with more care and more honesty than most portraits this length can sustain. The family at its center is not idealized. Homer is genuinely limited in ways that have consequences. Marge gives up genuinely important things. Bart is a boy who is failing at the one task his society is currently asking him to perform. Lisa is a child whose gifts are as painful as they are valuable. Maggie is a mystery that the show has been keeping for 36 years without losing patience. The town around them is not idealized either. Springfield is corrupt, polluted, economically precarious, culturally narrow in some ways and surprisingly broad in others, governed by institutions that serve themselves more reliably than they serve the people who depend on them. The richest man in town is a monster in the precise technical sense of something that cannot coexist with human life without destroying some of it. The town's police chief is an instrument of selective enforcement rather than of justice. The political system is owned by the same people who own everything else. And yet Springfield is not a dystopia. It is not a horror. It is a community, imperfect and compromised and sometimes unforgivable, but also warm and funny, and capable of the small acts of decency that stitch together social life, even when the larger structures are failing. The people of Springfield help each other in small ways constantly. They gather together for events, they share food, they show up when someone's house burns down even if they're part of the reason it caught fire in the first place. The community exists. It works, in its way. It is recognizable. The Simpsons has been holding up this portrait for 36 years, renewing it with each episode, keeping it current, making it relevant to whatever is happening in the world outside Springfield in any given season. The portrait has aged, as portraits do. Some of its colors have faded. Some of its lines have blurred. But the essential thing it is showing you, the essential truth it has always been trying to communicate, remains visible in every episode if you look for it. Ordinary life is the whole thing. The ordinary family, in the ordinary house, in the ordinary impossible town, the love that is imperfect and the comedy that is honest and the darkness that is real and the warmth that is earned. That is the show. That has always been the show. And that is why, 36 years on, with the golden age behind it and the future uncertain, with the characters unchanged and the world around them everything changed, we are still watching. Because we are still that family, in some version. We are still Homer, coming home at the end of a day that was too much. We are still Marge, holding things together through patient love that nobody fully sees. We are still Bart, performing indifference over something we care about more than we're willing to admit. We are still Lisa, trying to do right in a world that keeps explaining why right is inconvenient. And we are still Maggie, watching everything from behind our pacifiers, understanding more than we let on, waiting for our moment. The couch is there, the television is on, the credits are rolling, and somewhere in that house the family is already forgetting everything that happened this episode and resetting to the versions of themselves that will be ready to do it all again next week. Just like us. Just like always. Good night,